The most popular format in Magic is Commander. This is a format that's a multiplayer focus, a higher starting life total, and the titular commander that completely changes the way the format feels to play. This means that there are some cards that are staples in the format that are actually fairly weak in every other format. So today we're going over cards that change the most between Commander and the other formats. One thing before we start, cards that specifically refer to things like controlling your commander or having multiple opponents will be excluded in order to make the list more interesting. Starting us off at number 10, we have Swan Song. This is an instant with a mana cost of 1 blue with the effect where you counter target enchantment, instant, or sorcery spell, and then the spell's controller creates a 2/2 blue bird creature token with flying. This card is extremely efficient, but the downside of giving your opponent a 2/2 is a pretty big cost, or at least it is in most other formats. In Commander, where you start with 40 life, it basically gives your opponent a 1/1 in terms of how much damage it deals to you. This is such a small cost for such an efficient counterspell. The only other downside of the card is only being able to counter 3 card types. Luckily, the selection includes some very important card types. Enchantments are alright, but the really important card types are instants and sorceries. There are tons of really powerful instants and sorceries that a ton of decks want to play. Most importantly, most forms of interaction are instants and sorceries. This makes Swan Song not only a pretty good counterspell for stopping your opponent's plays, but also an amazing spell for protecting your own. It's no wonder that so many blue commander decks are running the card. So, why is it bad in other formats? Song is held back in other formats by a combination of the downside of giving your opponent a creature being worse, and there being better options. You see, because of the fact that Commander uses a playset of 1, combined with 99 card main boards, means that rather than just running 4 copies of the best version of a card, you have to run 1 copy of the best 8 versions of that effect if you want more of it. Rather than being able to run more copies of counterspells like Force of Will or Flusterstorm, like most of the decks usually do, blue decks that want to run lots of counterspells have to run 1 copy of Force, 1 copy of Fluster, and eventually will rather quickly run on the list of best counterspells to Swan Song. Now, the reason why Swan Song isn't that high on this list is that it has seen competitive success in other formats, though far, far less than it has in Commander. So it only breaks the top card on this list because it's a card that's good in other formats that's great in Commander, whereas other cards on this list are bad in most other formats and good in Commander. And at number 9, we have Sanctum of All. This is a legendary enchantment shrine with a mana cost of 1 white, 1 blue, 1 black, 1 red, and 1 green. It has the abilities where, at the beginning of your upkeep, you find a shrine card from your deck or graveyard and put it into the battlefield. It also has the ability where, if an ability of a shrine you control would trigger, and you control 6 or more shrines, it triggers an additional time. Shrines, for anyone who doesn't know, are a small archetype of enchantments connected by the shrine enchantment type. They each have abilities that scale with the number of shrines you have. For example, Hodin of Infinite Rage is a legendary shrine that costs 2 and 1 red. At the beginning of your upkeep, it deals 1 damage to any target for each shrine you control. Each of the other shrines has a similar ability. Sanctum of All is a pretty great payoff for a shrine deck, letting you not only find more shrines, but get even more value off of them. Shrines are a pretty weak archetype in most formats. They're too slow to outrun aggro or combo decks, and control decks are more than capable of stopping their game plan before they can really get it going. However, in Commander, this plan is a lot easier to put into place. 2 of the types of decks that I mentioned, aggro and control, are much less viable in Commander. It's really hard to blitz down 120 life from 3 players, or to grind out card advantage when your opponent draws 3 cards every turn to your 1. However, other combo decks are still an issue. Other combo decks can easily outrun shrines, but now that you don't have to worry about as many aggro control decks, shrine decks can focus more of their resources on playing more interactions to stop these decks from comboing off. Sanctum of All and shrines in general are a meme in every other format, but can compete in Commander, even putting some results up in the somewhat rare CEDH tournaments. And at number 8, we have First of the Suns. This is an artifact with a mana cost of 3, and the ability where you pay 1 mana for each color rather than pay the mana cost of spells you cast. So, for example, if you wanted to cast a spell like Omniscience, which normally would cost 7 and 3 blue, you can instead pay 1 white, 1 blue, 1 black, 1 red, and 1 green, paying a total of only 5 mana, getting quite the discount. Now, this card is usually pretty bad. It still costs 8 mana to cast your big threats, and it's a -1. There's also the issue where it's usually just outclassed by cards like Through the Breach, an instant that costs 4 and 1 red that lets you put a creature from your hand into the battlefield and gives it haste, a keyword that lets it attack that turn, but you have to sacrifice it at the end of the turn. So, for less mana, because you don't have to pay 3 on an earlier turn, and less specific colors of mana, you can also cheat out a big threat and get to attack with it right away. Fist has a few upsides over Through the Breach as well. It can let you pay 5 to cast a card from anywhere, not just your hand, so it can work on cards and zones that Through the Breach can't. It also sticks around and lets you use its ability again, and can work on cards other than creatures. However, Through the Breach is usually a far better card for 60 card formats. usually only need one turn to win with whatever you're going to cheat into play, as you're probably cheating something like Emrakul, which will force your opponent to sacrifice 6 permanents when it attacks. Since most threats you'll be cheating out have this much of an impact, you only really need one turn with them to win. It's also much easier to use in most formats. Paying 3 mana followed by 1 mana of each color is so hard to get together, especially compared to 4 and 1 red. Because of these upsides, no one has ever played Fists over other cards. Not to mention that Through the Breach isn't seen playing right now anyway, as it's not quite good enough. However, in Commander, Fist upsides matter a lot more. A single turn with a card like Emrakul isn't enough to win a game in Commander, as you have 3 opponents you need to kill. Though technically Emrakul is banned in Commander, so you'd have to use a different creature, but that's not all that important. Another upside is being able to use the effect multiple times. As you want to kill multiple opponents, you'll want multiple big threats on board. However, one of the best upsides is that you can use it to do things like cast your commander for 1 mana of each color, whereas Through the Breach won't be able to do anything, because your commander isn't technically in your hand. If your commander is a card like the Dragon, a massive creature that costs 9 mana to cast, Fist will give you a permanent 4 mana discount each time you have to cast your commander. The ability to cast multiple big threats for a huge discount is really strong in a format like Commander, where you need to deal so much damage to so many players. Fist of Suns is one of those cards that's usually a win more card in most formats, but in Commander, you need to win more sometimes. And at number 7, we have Arcane Denial. This is an instant with a mana cost of 1 and 1 blue, with the effect where you counter target spell, then at the beginning of the next turn's upkeep, you draw 1 card, and that spell's controller draws 2 cards. Arcane Denial is usually pretty bad, as it's a straight -1 in card advantage. Considering lots of formats have access to cards like Counterspell, which can do its job while being card neutral, there's not much of a reason to play Arcane Denial over the other counterspells available. However, this match changes in Commander. You see, the concept of card advantage changes a little bit in Commander, because you have 3 opponents. So if you use a counterspell on an opponent's card, you each lose 1 card, while your 2 other opponents each lose nothing. So both of you go -1 to 2 opponents, who now both have 1 more card than either of you. However, if you use Arcane Denial, you'll go -1 to your opponent whose spell you countered and gave you 2 cards, but stay even with the other 2 opponents. In some way, this is even better, because you're only going -1 against 1 opponent instead of 2. This means that Arcane Denial in terms of card advantage is basically the same as playing a normal counterspell, if not better, depending on how you want to count card advantage in a multiplayer format. However, there are still some downsides. Giving one of your opponents 2 cards can be a big boost, and can sometimes backfire, because sometimes it will give them the cards they need to win the game. Arcane Denial is a staple counterspell and sees tons of play in the format. Comparing that to a basically 0 play anywhere else, and you have a card that easily slides onto this list. And at number 6, we have Torment of Hailfire. This is a sorcery with a mana cost of X, meaning any amount of mana, and 2 black. It has the effect where you repeat the following X times. Each opponent loses 3 life unless they discard a card or sacrifice a non-land permanent. This card can easily be a game ender if you have enough mana to pump into it. However, this usually isn't feasible in most 60 card formats. There definitely are ways to make a lot of mana, but it's usually better to spend this mana on something else. As if you're going to spend 8 mana on something, it's probably better to play something like an Archon of Cruelty, rather than make your opponent pitch some cards to this to stay alive. However, in Commander, the slower games let people make a ton of mana. Usually, people will use cards like Cabal Coffers, a land that lets you pay 2 and tap it to add 1 black for each swamp you control. Combine it with Urborg, which makes all land swamps in addition to their other types, and this can basically add 1 black for each land you control. Combining it with some black's other mana doublers, such as Nirkana Revenant, which adds an additional black mana each time you tap a swamp for mana, combining these cards together, you can make huge amounts of mana really easily. For example, with these 3 cards and a total of 8 lands, you can cast a Torment of Hailfire for X equals 19, which will do so much damage and make your opponent sacrifice so many cards and discard so much that it will usually end the game. This isn't viable in other formats for a few reasons. First off, a higher life totals means that games go longer, letting you get more lands more easily. Secondly, mana doublers are very scary, and players will usually try to remove them on sight. However, in Commander, where there are 4 players all playing scary cards and using up their removal on different threats, the likelihood of any one threat sticking rises. This makes these sort of big mana combos more likely. The reason cards like Torment are nice is that they can always make use of all of your mana, whereas other threats like Archon can leave you with unspent mana and not quite close the game for you. It's also worth mentioning Villainous Wealth, a sorcery that costs X, 1 black, 1 green, and 1 blue, and lets you exile the top X cards of an opponent's library and cast any number of those cards that cost X or less without paying their mana cost. The story with Villainous Wealth is about the same as with Torment, but being more colors makes it less of a staple, whereas Torment can see play in any black deck. And at number 5, we have Triumph of the Hordes. This is a sorcery with a mana cost of 2 and 2 green with the effect where until the end of the turn, each creature you control gets +1/+1 and gains trample, meaning excess combat damage is dealt to the defending player, and infect, meaning they deal damage in the form of -1/-1 counters to creatures and poison counters to players. And in case someone doesn't know, if a player ever has 10 or more poison counters, they lose the game. Triumph seems like a great way for a creature deck to end the game, but it hasn't been successful anywhere outside of Commander. You see, Triumph doesn't really fit in anywhere. In a non-infect deck, unless you manage to push for lethal the turn you cast it, all the damage is basically wasted. If you lower your opponent's life total with attacks beforehand, this won't help you kill them with poison. However, in a dedicated infect deck, Triumph's effect to give your creatures with infect an additional instance of infect is entirely redundant. Infect decks would rather just play normal pump spells that give bigger bonuses. Since dealing 10 damage to your opponent in a single combat step is usually too difficult, Triumph doesn't really work in most formats. In Commander, however, it looks much better. Normally to win the game, you have to deal 120 damage to all 3 of your opponents. Triumph cuts that number down to 30, a much more manageable amount. Secondly, creature-based decks are more likely to develop a big board, as board stalls are far more common in that format. This means that Triumph slots into the format much better, and is capable of ending games far more often. Sure, you still have the problem of 2 of your types of damage not working together, but since you can get a bigger board more easily, and since it essentially quadruples your damage to players, this doesn't matter. There's only one card that ends games of Commander the way Triumph does, and that's Caterhoof Behemoth. This is a giant creature that gives all of your creatures +X/+X until the end of the turn when it enters the battlefield, where X is the number of creatures you control. This is even stronger than Triumph on some board states, but Caterhoof is actually really good in a number of formats outside of Commander, so it wasn't eligible for this list. And at number 4, we have Rhystic Study. This is an enchantment with a mana cost of 2 and 1 blue, with the ability where whenever an opponent casts a spell, you may draw 1 card unless your opponent pays 1. I feel like a lot of people saw this one coming. Rhystic Study is a famously good Commander staple that's pretty easy to understand why it's not as good in other formats. In most formats, Rhystic Study asks you to pay 3 mana for what's basically a worse version of Sphere Resistance. Sphere is a 2 mana artifact that makes it so all spells cost 1 more to cast. This means the effect isn't one-sided, like Rhystic Studies is, but it has 2 huge advantages over Study. First off, the mana cost is way easier to work with. Not only does it cost less mana, it costs generic mana. This means you can cast off something like Ancient Tomb, which is a land that lets you tap it for 2 colorless and take 2 damage. So if you want to tax your opponent, there are cards that outclass Study. However, there's one other big advantage that cards like Sphere have over Study. Your opponent doesn't get to choose which effects you get. These cards that let your opponent choose what detrimental effect to deal with, called Punisher effects by the community, have to be way above rate to see any play. Your opponent can choose whatever effect hurts them the least at any time. So if your opponent can afford to pay the mana, they'll do that. And if they can afford to give you cards, they'll do that instead. The combination of being kind of expensive for the effect and your opponent being able to play has led to the card never seen play in any format besides Commander. In Commander, the card is a lot better. The thing is, the card scales with extra opponents really well. The more opponents you have, the more spells Rhystic Study will trigger on, and the more times your opponent will be forced to not pay the 1 and give you an extra card. This means that Rhystic Study will draw you 3 times the amount of cards it normally would, and the extra draw really matters. Combine that with longer game length, and you get a card that goes from drawing you 1 or 2 cards a game to drawing you 10 cards a game. All of this together makes Study one of the best draw spells in the entire format. We should quickly mention Mystic Remora, a similar enchantment that costs 1 blue and has a cumulative upkeep of 1, which means every turn you put a time counter on it and then have to pay 1 for each time counter on it or sacrifice it, and whenever an opponent casts a non-creature spell, you draw a card unless they pay 4. This card is arguably better than Study, but it sees quite a bit of play in Vintage, so it was too successful in other formats to qualify for this list. And at number 3, we have Temur Sabertooth. This is a 4/3 cat with a mana cost of 2 and 2 green, with the ability where you can pay 1 and 1 green, and then you can return another creature you control to its owner's hand, and if you do, it gains indestructible until the end of the turn. This ability is almost never worth it, as bouncing a creature back to your hand to save a 4/3 is way too high of a cost. You can use it to bounce another creature in response to a removal spell, but that's still not amazing. 4 mana for a badly statted creature that lets you pay more mana in the future to dodge some removal is just too expensive. However, there are ways to make use of Sabertooth. You see, if you have a card like Moldrifter, which allows you to draw 2 cards when it enters the battlefield, you can use Sabertooth to return it to your hand just so that you can play it again to draw even more cards. However, this is usually kind of unnecessary. Cards like Ghostly Flicker, which allow you to exile cards and then return them to the battlefield right away, this saves you the trouble of having to pay the Moldrifter's mana cost again. The upside of Sabretooth over these effects is that you can do it as many times as you have the mana for, but this is usually too slow and kind of a win more strategy. However, in Commander, its use cases go way up. There are a few legendary creatures that allow you to untap all of your lands, such as Zakima, which untaps all of your lands whenever it enters the battlefield if you cast it. So, if you have 12 lands in the battlefield, or lands that can tap for 12 mana with cards like Wild Growth, you can tap all of your lands for 12 mana, cast Zakima, using 9 mana, leaving you with 3 floating and untap all of your lands. You can then activate Sabretooth to bounce it back to your hand, leaving 1 floating mana and all of your lands untapped. Each time you do this, you'll net 1 mana, meaning you can make infinite mana. And since Zakima has 3 separate mana sinks on it, you can probably win the game right there. This can get into similar loops with cards like Intruder Alarm, a card that untaps all creatures whenever a creature enters the battlefield, and creatures that tap for mana. The need for higher powered combos and slower game speeds makes Sabretooth a real option for decks that want to repeat enter battlefield triggers, and these game-ending combos are far more practical than you think. And at number 2, we have Teferi's Protection. This is an instant with a mana cost of 2 and 1 white. It has the effect where, until your next turn, your life total can't change and you gain protection from everything, which means nothing can damage, target, or be attached to you. Also, all your permanents phase out, which means they're treated as if they don't exist and phase back in before you untap on your next turn. Then you exile Teferi's Protection. Teferi's Protection is basically a mix of fog and a protection spell, which unfortunately isn't all that great. In most formats, fogs are very bad. Simply stopping yourself from taking any damage for a turn doesn't really accomplish much of anything. You go down 1 card, but your opponent hasn't lost anything at all, and can just kill you again on the next turn. Now, Protection does have the ability to protect you from combos that would kill you, not just from combat, but this isn't all that great either. If you want to stop your opponent from comboing off, there's almost always a better card for the job. Normal interaction like counter spells, discard spells, or simple removal will usually do better. The ability to protect your board is better, but not enough. Protecting your entire board from a Wrath can be strong, but it requires leaving up so much mana that it's very impractical. Cards like Blossoming Defense that save a single threat from a spot removal are far easier to actually use, and are therefore more heavily played. All of this changes in Commander. Fogs are much better in Commander, as players will usually use a card like the previously mentioned Triumph of the Hordes or Caterhoof Behemoth to try and push for lethal. So using a fog effect is more of an even trade. Additionally, being able to save you from most combos is a way better deal, as there are no sideboards in Commander, so you can't tailor your deck to deal with a specific combo. A card that can save you from a bunch of different combos goes way up in value in a situation like that. And since Wraths are way more common, having a way to answer them is better too. With all this in mind, it's not a surprise that this card was tailor-made for the format. However, as good as Teferi's Protection is, there is one Commander staple that's even better, and still not very good in other formats. And all the way at number 1, we have Dockside Extortionist. This is a 1/2 Goblin Pirate with a mana cost of 1 and 1 red, with the ability where, when it enters the battlefield, for each artifact and enchantment your opponent controls, you create a treasure token. These are artifacts that you can tap and sacrifice to add 1 mana of any color. This card is pretty infamous in Commander circles, with some players even asking for the card to be banned in the format. Before we get to that, we should go over why Dockside isn't good in formats like Legacy and Vintage. In Legacy, artifacts and enchantments are kind of rare, so you can't count on your opponent having them. That means that you would need to sideboard the card. But if you're going to bring a card in from the sideboard to punish artifact decks, why not bring in a card like Stony Silence that turns off all artifacts' activated abilities, or even a card like Serenity, which destroys all artifacts and enchantments during your upkeep. If you want to punish these decks, there are cards that are more practical, as the 3 or 4 mana the card will give you won't be enough to win you the game or anything. The same is largely true for Vintage, though artifacts are much more heavily played in that format. In Commander, however, things change. Artifact ramp is played in almost every deck, so Dockside will always give you value. Additionally, cards like Stony Silence and Serenity aren't anywhere near as game-winning as they are in other formats. You can't just shut down your opponent for a few turns and try to win through combat in Commander, as your opponents simply have too much life. Additionally, the extra mana Dockside will give you in that format, closer to 6 or 7 on average cast, is way more useful. This is usually more than enough mana to put a combo together, or at least an imposing board state. This isn't even getting into the multiple ways to use this mana to loop Dockside and make infinite mana, with cards like the previously mentioned Timur Sabretooth. This has made Dockside such a staple in the format that not a single red deck that's trying to win doesn't play the card. Dockside is one of the best cards in the entire format, and yet still isn't just good anywhere but in Commander. In the Commander format, one of the most important rules is that you can only run cards that match your Commander's color identity. As such, one might think that monocolor decks, or cards with only one color, have an inherent disadvantage in that they're limited to just one color as a pool of cards. Despite this, monocolor decks have never struggled in the format, with monocolor decks prevalent in both casual and competitive Commander alike. Starting off with number 10, we have Tergrid, God of Fright. This legendary creature is a god that costs 3 generic and 2 black mana, and has 4 power and 5 toughness, as well as the keyword menace, which makes it so Tergrid can only be blocked with 2 or more creatures. The main appeal of Tergrid as a commander is its other ability that takes any non-token permanent your opponent sacrifices, or any permanent card that they discard, and puts that card into your battlefield under your control. Essentially, you're able to steal any permanents that's discarded or sacrificed no matter what caused it. This effect notably works from any form of discard to both yours and your opponent's, meaning that it's quite easy for Tergrid to trigger throughout the course of a game of Commander. And when built around as your commander, there are plenty of cards that are aggressively good combined with her ability. Living Death makes every player sacrifice all creatures they control in exchange for bringing back every creature that was in their graveyard before the spell resolves. Even though you'll sacrifice Tergrid as well, her ability will see every other creature sacrificed alongside her, and you'll be able to steal away every creature your opponent sacrificed. Dark Deal makes every player discard their hand and then draw that many cards -1, which means with Tergrid, any permanent stuck in your opponent's hands becomes yours. There are plenty of ways for Tergrid to take multiple cards from each player at once, allowing the Tergrid player to supercharge their board with their opponent's cards. This isn't even all that Tergrid can do, however, since she also has a back half that can be cast instead, Tergrid's Lantern. This legendary artifact costs 3 generic and 1 black mana, and can be tapped to make target player lose 3 life unless they sacrifice a non-land permanent or discard a card. You can also pay 3 generic mana and 1 black mana to untap Tergrid's Lantern. While this back half is generally less impactful in Commander than Tergrid's front half, it can be relevant. If you manage to make infinite black mana, you can use Tergrid's Lantern to eventually take out each opponent through repeat activations. Even without infinite mana, mono-black decks in the format have access to Cabal Coffers and can generate a large amount of mana to grind down opponents in the late game. That said, it's Tergrid's front half that has led to her being one of the most played mono-black commanders in the format. However, she only really sees any play in more casual Commander tables, and as such she is only 10th on this list. And at number 9, we have Teferi, Temporal Archmage. This planeswalker costs 4 generic and 2 blue mana and enters with 5 loyalty. Teferi specifically has an ability which allows you to run him as your commander, and is without a doubt the strongest Lingo Planeswalker commander. You can add 1 loyalty to Teferi to look at the top 2 cards of your library, put one of them into your hand, and the other on the bottom of your library. And by removing 1 loyalty, you can untap up to 4 target permanents. And then Teferi's ultimate ability allows you to remove 10 loyalty counters to get an emblem with you may activate loyalty abilities of planeswalkers you control on any player's turn at any time you could cast an instant. All 3 of these abilities are good, with the +1 ability essentially being sleight of hand. However, it is Teferi's -1 ability that has allowed the commander to become so prominent. Untapping 4 permanents in one go is quite a bit. And given the density of powerful mana rocks in the format, it's easy to abuse this loyalty ability. The most simple way of doing so is via the Chain Veil. This legendary artifact lets you pay 4 mana and tap it to use a planeswalker's loyalty ability as if none of its abilities have been activated this turn. This essentially allows you to reuse Teferi. If you have 3 artifacts that collectively produce at least 5 mana when tapped, you can target those 3 artifacts and the Chain Veil with Teferi's minus ability to untap them. From there, you can keep doing this until Teferi is on his last loyalty counter. Then you remove the last one and let Teferi go to the commander zone. You leave the Chain Veil tapped this time and instead untap those same 3 artifacts as well as another mana source of your choice. Since the Chain Veil's ability specifically modifies the game rules, it affects not just planeswalkers you control, but planeswalkers that come under your control later in the turn. This means when you recast Teferi, it will enter with essentially extra loyalty activations equal to the number of times you've activated the Chain Veil. You're free to continue this loop until you've amassed enough loyalty activations that you can use the +1 ability to draw your whole deck. This is just the primary combo the deck runs. Since the printed Displacer Kitten, the deck has access to new combo lines involving blinking Teferi with the kitten and attempting to storm through the deck. There are not many legal Planeswalker commanders available in the format, and even fewer have the same level of sheer combo potential as Teferi does. Coming in at number 8, we have Magda, Brazen Outlaw. This legendary dwarf berserker costs 1 generic and 1 red mana, and has 2 power and 1 toughness. Magda gives other dwarves you control +1 power, and whenever a dwarf you control becomes tapped, you create a treasure token, which can be tapped and sacrificed for 1 mana of any color. Magda's other effect allows you to sacrifice 5 treasures to instead search your library for an artifact or dragon card and put it onto the battlefield. Now, dwarves are not typically a powerful or relevant creature type in any format. However, Magda's abilities have allowed her to find great success in competitive Commander. While the pool of playable dwarves is small, there are a few niche options that actively allow Magda to function as a combo piece. One common combo is using an artifact creature that's a shapeshifter. A creature like Metallic Mimic can enter the battlefield as a dwarf. And while Mono Red is lacking in ways of untapping creatures to abuse Magda's ability, it does have access to cards which can tap and untap artifacts fairly easily. Clock of Omens can untap an artifact if you tap 2 artifacts, which for Magda means you can tap the artifact dwarf and a treasure to then untap the dwarf and produce a treasure in the process. This allows you to generate infinite tapped treasures. From there, you can use Magda's ability to sacrifice 5 of those treasures to search up Muskwood Nexus. This card allows you to pick a creature type, and all creatures and creature cards you have become that type no matter what zone they're in. Since Magna's ability can search artifacts or dragons, if you search Maskwood Nexus and name a dragon, suddenly Magna can sacrifice treasures to grab any creature in your deck. From there, you can grab something like Zorn that doubles your treasure production, then repeat your previous combo to generate infinite untapped treasures as well. Then, with infinite mana, you can search up a mana outlet that burns, such as Scargun Hellkite, and win on the spot. While this combo needs multiple cards, since Magna is in your commander zone and the most important singular piece, the deck is still fairly consistent. There are enough artifact creatures that can either change their creature type, or have every creature type that there are multiple artifact creatures dwarves can run, even though there aren't any that have been printed. There are other untapped combos one can use, and even some combos that require to use Maskwood Nexus for dwarves instead of dragons. Despite only having one color in the deck's color identity, Magna has proven to be one of the most versatile and powerful monocolor combo decks in the format. And at number 7, we have Yawgmoth Thran Physician. This legendary human cleric costs 2 generic and 1 black mana, and has 2 power and 4 toughness. Yawgmoth has protection from humans, meaning it cannot be damaged, blocked, or targeted by any creature that's human. It also allows you to pay 1 life and sacrifice another creature to put a -1/-1 counter on up to 1 target creature and draw a card. You may also pay 2 black mana and discard a card to proliferate, which allows you to choose any number of permanents and or players with counters on them and to give them another counter of one kind they already have. These effects make Yawgmoth an effective grind engine for sacrifice-focused decks, given the option of card draw and potential removal through -1/-1 counters. However, Yawgmoth's greatest strength as a commander lies in its combo potential. Of note, Yawgmoth interacts quite well with the keyword ability Undying. A creature with Undying returns to the battlefield under its owner's control with a +1/+1 counter after dying, as long as it didn't already have a +1/+1 counter on it. In practice, this means that the Undying ability will not work after reviving the creature once. But if that +1/+1 counter is removed, then the Undying ability can trigger again and revive the creature again. Giving a creature with a +1/+1 counter a -1/-1 counter just removes both as they cancel each other out. As such, if Yawgmoth gives an Undying creature that counter, it can keep coming back. This can be used to go infinite if you have 2 creatures with Undying and a life drain effect like Blood Artist. With 2 Undying creatures, they can go back and forth getting the counter and being sacrificed, with Blood Artist both regaining you life you lost to Yawgmoth so you don't die, while also eventually draining all of your opponents. You can also substitute one of the Undying creatures with a token generator like Nest of Scarabs to have fodder to sacrifice to give your Undying creatures its -1/-1 counter. Notably, this isn't even the only combo line available to Yawgmoth specifically. Blasted Citadel is a powerful artifact that can be cast from the top of your library by paying life instead of mana. If you're ever stuck with a land on your deck that might stop the chain of spells you're casting, you can use Yawgmoth's ability to draw a card and clear the top of your deck. This becomes a game-winning combo alongside Aetherflux Reservoir, which will gain you life exponentially whenever you cast spells. It will eventually gain you enough life where you can use its secondary ability to pay 50 life to deal 50 damage to any target, and eventually hit every opponent. All of this is to say that Yawgmoth's abilities lend him to great combo potential, as well as his grindy mid-range game, which has led him to being so prominent in the format. And at number 6, we have Oswald Fiddlebender. This legendary gnome artificer costs 1 generic and 1 white mana, and has 2 power and toughness. Oswald has the ability Magical Tinkering, which lets you pay 1 white mana, tap Oswald, and sacrifice an artifact to search your library for an artifact with a mana value equal to 1 plus the sacrifice artifact mana's value, and put it onto the battlefield. You're only allowed to activate this ability at sorcery speed, meaning you're not allowed to use it in a reactive context. However, this restriction was also on the card Oswald's based on, the infamous Birthing Pod, which is banned in Modern for how potent it was. Birthing Pod could search creatures, whereas Oswald could search artifacts. Oswald has a lower mana value than Birthing Pod, but since Oswald is a creature, Summoning Sickness means you'll have to wait a turn to use the effect. That said, the effect is incredibly powerful. Artifacts are an important backstone in most commander decks, since many decks use artifacts for their mana acceleration. Oswald decks opt to run artifacts at every mana value, so they always have an option to grab with Oswald. In competitive commander, Oswald decks tend to run a suite of powerful yet narrow artifacts to search out to counter specific strategies, such as using Torpor Orb to hinder creature-based strategies. If you ever are hindered by one of your own artifacts, you can just sacrifice it to your commander to get rid of it and trade up into a new artifact. This toolbox strategy allows the Oswald decks to grind longer against decks with a higher ceiling by actively hindering their game plans. This buys time for the Oswald decks to find an open window to try and combo off. Given the fact that Oswald himself can search up artifacts, it opens up the deck to rely on various multi-card combos. Some builds rely on looping Suchi, an artifact creature that can be searched or sacrificed with Oswald and generates 4 colorless mana whenever it dies. Oswald also has access to Scrap Trawler combos, where it's used alongside other artifacts that can bring artifacts from the graveyard to repeatedly generate mana and draw cards off of cards such as Chromatic Star. While mono-white decks tend to struggle more than other colors in Commander, Oswald has proven to be a popular and powerful commander with a high toolbox and combo potential. And at number 5, we have Marwyn the Nurturer. This legendary elf druid costs 2 generic and 1 green mana, and has 1 power and toughness. Whenever another elf enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on Marwyn. You can then tap Marwyn to add 1 green mana equal to Marwyn's power. This means while Marwyn at default is an overpriced Lenora Elves, both her stats and mana production increase with each elf you play. Elves have always been a creature type focused on mana production and swarming the board. And while you can theoretically play a lot of elves to make Marwyn's mana production worthwhile, in practice Marwyn only needs 4 power to realistically win the game. Umbral Mantle is an equipment that specifically gives the equipped creature the ability to untap itself by paying 3 mana. This means if Marwyn can tap for 4 or more mana, you can use 3 of that mana to untap it, meaning you're free to tap her again and have netted 1 green mana in the process. As such, Marwyn makes infinite mana quite easily, and without too much power as long as you find the right cards to go with it. Another option is the artifact Staff of Domination, which not only can untap Marwyn, but also provides a way to draw through your entire deck once you have the infinite mana. Of course, these combos do rely on you finding specific artifacts, which is a card type green is not effective at searching. However, even if Marwyn's specific combos aren't searchable, Marwyn still provides scaling mana acceleration as you look for combo pieces, or search up one of your other creature-based combos. Other combos, such as using Hirumaredx Ranger to untap a creature by bouncing a forest back to your hand, and using that alongside an elf that can put a land into the battlefield from your hand, actively synergizes with Marwyn, since even if you can't pull off one of the infinite combos requiring another card, you can still use Hirumaredx Ranger to get far ahead of mana by untapping Marwyn. Elf combo decks have always focused on essentially churning through their whole deck as fast as possible, and Marwyn helps account for the mana part of the equation. As such, when it comes to variety of creature-based spell-slinging combos, Marwyn has become the go-to commander in green. And at number 4, we have Kirik, Son of Yawgmoth. This legendary Phyrexian horror minion costs 4 generic and 3 Phyrexian black mana, and has 2 power and toughness. Phyrexian black mana can be paid with either 1 black mana or 2 life, meaning that Kirik's mana cost is somewhat modular. If you're willing to lose 6 life, you can cast Kirik for 4 generic mana. Kirik's ability allows you to replace the black mana in any of its spell or abilities costs with paying 2 life instead, essentially making all of your black mana costs into Phyrexian black mana costs. Whenever you cast a black spell, you put +1/+1 counters on Kirik, which plays into his lifelink ability. Lifelink means whenever he deals damage, you gain that much life, which helps offset all of the life you lose by playing him as your commander. This is because Kirik decks aim to play aggressively, using their life entirely as a resource to win the game as quickly as possible. A card like Necrompotence becomes essentially free with Kirik on board, since it only costs specifically black mana. And since black has so many search effects and can grab any card, the deck is full of redundancy. Kirik in specific has access to more search effects than most commanders, since cards like Beseech the Queen are much better when they cost little to no actual mana. The aforementioned Aetherflux Reservoir is even more important here, with its exponential life gain. Kirik's biggest weakness is just how much life you lose in the process of playing your cards, especially since many of your strongest spells to cast with Kirik will make you lose even more life. Aetherflux Reservoir lets you recoup and eventually go positive with Kirik's casting and eventually deal lethal damage to your opponent. Since you tend to cast so many spells in a single turn, storm cards such as Tendrils of Agony can be used to take players out of the game, or at the very least regain you a significant chunk of life to continue your comboing. The card is notably also quite popular in casual commander, since Kirik can be used just as easily to make large splashy spells cost less as he can be used to combo. This is why he's the highest black commander on the list. However, the top 3 are more infamous or potent commanders themselves. Coming in at number 3, we have Orvar the All-Form. This legendary shapeshifter costs 3 generic mana and 1 blue mana, and has 3 power and toughness. It has Changeling, which means it has all creature types at all times, and also has an ability that whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, if it targets 1 or more other permanents you control, create a token that's a copy of one of those permanents. Its other ability is that whenever a spell or ability an opponent controls causes you to discard this card, create a token that's a copy of target permanent. Since Orvar is your commander, the discard effect doesn't come up too often, and Orvar is mostly played for its popular and powerful ability to copy permanents you target with a spell. Blue has no shortage of cards that can target permanents cheaply. Many of these cards, such as Whim of Volrath, would normally never see play for being too narrow or not doing anything all that good. However, the primary effect you're aiming for isn't the spell effect, but Orvar's copying. As such, as long as a spell is cheap and targets something with a marginal form of upside, it's worth considering for Orvar. Since Orvar doesn't limit you to permanent types, the general early game plan is to copy your mana rocks to get ahead on mana. From there, you want to draw through your deck using targeted spells that replace themselves, to then copy permanents that draw cards or otherwise search through your deck. Like many of the commanders on this list, Orvar lends itself to being a combo commander that uses its ability in the commander zone to give your combo game plan more consistency. But what makes Orvar so popular is that even if you aren't going for a more competitive storm build, the ability to copy any permanent you control appeals to all sorts of casual strategies. Given that Orvar technically is every creature type, It also provides a commander for many creature types that otherwise lack one. Orvar's biggest weakness comes from the fact that without your commander, the deck suffers greatly since many of your spells are quite weak targeting spells. But blue is able to run various counterspells and pieces of interaction to help protect your commander and the eventual win you try to establish. Despite being printed as recently as Kaldheim, Orvar is already one of the most widely played mono-blue commanders given its power and various uses. And at number 2, we have Yisan, the Wanderer Bard. This legendary human rogue costs 2 generic and 1 green mana and has 2 power and 3 toughness. You may pay 2 generic and 1 green mana and tap Yisan to put a verse counter on him. Then you search your library for a creature card with a mana value equal to the number of verse counters and put it onto the battlefield. This effect is quite similar to Birthing Pod, in that it allows you to essentially go up a chain of mana values and search out creatures. However, unlike Birthing Pod, you don't actually sacrifice anything, and in exchange are able to set a specific mana value every time you activate Yisan. While at the surface this may seem limiting, since if Yisan is ever removed, you have to start back over at the mana value of 1 and work your way back up. In practice, it means Yisan has consistent combo lines that Birthing Pod effects otherwise don't have. Birthing Pod relies on you to have the right creature to find what you want, whereas Yisan decks have dedicated combo lines that start from 1 and work their way up and win the game in the process. A key part of this comes from searching up creatures that can untap Yisan and generate mana, meaning that some of the mana generating packages mentioned in Morrowind also come into play. But instead, you focus specifically on reusing Yisan, eventually reaching creatures such as Woodland Bellower to search up other creatures off the chain and spiral out from there. Yisan swarms the board in attempts to combo off, but even if the combo is disrupted, its density of powerful creatures disperse throughout the mana curve, allowing him to make for a decent creature toolbox deck. Caterhoof Behemoth is the general high end of most Yisan decks, and a finisher for when the combo plans don't quite pan out, given how much damage it can push even in Commander. Yisan has been an infamous commander for his combo potential for years, and has also proven popular in casual given how he facilitates you searching out and playing all sorts of green creatures. While Yisan is no longer a top tier threat in the world of competitive like he might once have been, he remains one of the most prominent monocolor commanders to ever exist, and still sees plenty of play to this very day. And finally, at number 1, we have Godo, Bandit Warlord. This legendary human barbarian costs 5 generic and 1 red mana, and has 3 power and toughness. When Godo enters the battlefield, you may search your library for an equipment card and put it onto the battlefield. Whenever Godo attacks for the first time each turn, untap it and all samurai you control. After this phase, there is an additional combat phase. At surface level, this might not seem all that impressive, especially since even with recent support, samurai aren't too powerful of a creature type. However, Godo's prominence comes in the form of being a combo deck that can essentially win with just Godo itself. This is because Godo can search one specific equipment, Helm of the Host. While these cards were printed years apart, Helm of the Host feels custom made to abuse with Godo. This equipment makes a token copy of the creature it equips to at the start of the combat phase that has haste and thus can attack right away. Helm of the Host specifically makes a token not legendary, even if the creature it's copying is legendary, meaning your copies of Godo all survive. If you equip Godo, you won't even really abuse the equipment searching from its enter the battlefield effect. Instead, you specifically aim to get additional copies of the attack trigger. Since the attack trigger gives you an additional combat phase, it triggers Helm to make a new Godo, and you can continue attacking with your new Godo until every opponent is dead. This combo doesn't require you to have any specific card in hand, since Godo starts in the commander zone and represents full combo. As such, the deck is focused instead on mana production, with the main deck focused on running fast mana and interaction to protect the combo. While the combo does require 11 mana, this is not impossible to make on turn 1 in red. There are various spells like Desperate Ritual that go positive on mana for a quick one-time burst of mana. However, the best card to facilitate a turn 1 win with Godo is Treasonous Ogre, which lets you pay 3 life to make 1 red mana. This is a repeatable effect, so if you find a hand with Treasonous Ogre, you can dump your life in an attempt to win. Godo plays fast and aggressive, aiming to win before more versatile decks get established. These decks are wholly reliant on their commander and cannot exist in the same capacity in other formats, since it relies on the commander zone to make it a one-card combo essentially. As such, Godo stands as perhaps the most notable mono-color commander, given both its genuine viability in competitive commander, but also how integral Godo is to the deck functioning. The most important part of building a commander deck is choosing your commander. Of the many legendary creatures and other LEGO commanders in the game, there are some that stand out as clearly more popular and powerful than others. Today we'll be going over 10 of the strongest 2-color commanders and what makes them such popular choices for the format. Starting us off at number 10, we have Gearson Starn Kellamorph. This legendary Tyranid human costs 1 generic, 1 blue, and 1 red mana, and has 3 power and 2 toughness. Gearson has Ward 2, which means whenever he becomes the target of a spell or an ability an opponent controls, counter it unless that player pays 2 generic mana. Whenever another source you control deals exactly 1 damage to a permanent or player, Gearson Starn deals 2 damage to that permanent or player. This ability essentially turns any ping for 1 damage into a full-on lightning bolt. This ability turns cards that would otherwise be unplayable into aggressively costed wraths and burn spells. And the festivities will deal 3 damage to each opponent and every other creature they control while leaving yours untouched for just a single red mana. Creatures that can tap to ping for damage, like the classic Prodigal Sorcerer, suddenly represent even more damage. But what really sets Gearsenstarn apart is how it deals the extra 2 damage itself. If you enchant Gearsenstarn with Curiosity, then every time his ability triggers, you'll draw a card. If you give Gearsenstarn Death Touch, then his pings will be able to kill any creature on the board, and if equipped with Grafted Exoskeleton, he gains Infect, and only needs to ping someone 5 times to kill them with Infect. While it's generally unlikely you'll win every game off the back of Gryson's ability directly, the board control he offers as well as the card draw synergies available make him a perfect commander for the grind game. Ward makes him an unfavorable target to try and remove, and it's not too difficult for the card to overtake the commander pod with the other creature-focused decks. Gearsenstar decks will use their powerful board control game plan to buy time for a combo win condition, usually built around Underworld Breach. The only major downside to him as a commander is that without him on the board, many of your burn spells are not that impressive, and generally lackluster for a game of commander. But when he's on the board and protected, there's no denying his ability to overtake a commander game with relative ease. And at number 9, we have Sithis, a Harvest Hand. This legendary enchantment creature is a nymph that costs 1 green and 1 white mana, and has 1 power and toughness. Whenever you cast an enchantment spell, you gain 1 life and draw a card. Sithis is a type of card known as an enchantress, a creature that draws you a card whenever you play an enchantment. While enchantment decks have always been popular in Commander, before Sithis, they lacked a true consistent way to play a dedicated Enchantress-style deck. In other formats, you can run multiple copies of Mesa Enchantress, whereas in Commander, you're limited to 1 of each individual Enchantress. While there is a decent bit of redundancy, there was never any guaranteed you'd start the game with access to one. Sithis rectifies this by essentially making it so you start every game with an Enchantress in your opening hand, since 1 is your commander. This makes wild growth effects even stronger in the early game, since they double as cantrips with your commander and allow you to run ahead of the rest of the pot. Sithis ranks somewhat low on this list in part because she herself isn't much of a win condition. She's essentially an extra, guaranteed copy of one of your main card advantage engines, which makes her powerful and popular in Commander, but not one that will overtake a game quite like the others on this list. Still, Sithis remains one of the most popular commanders at multiple levels of play, with casual Enchantress builds as common as more streamlined builds that focus on hate enchantments like Rest in Peace. Beyond the enchantment focus, there's no one set theme for building her, which makes her more open-ended than many of the other commanders on this list. Overall, Sithis is undoubtedly a commander one will likely see for years to come. And at number 8, we have Shurikai Genesis Engine. This legendary artifact is a vehicle that costs 2 generic, 1 white, and 1 blue mana, has 8 power and toughness, and can be your commander. It has Crew 8, which allows you to tap any number of your creatures with a total power of 8 or more to make Shurikai an artifact creature until the end of turn. You can pay 1 generic mana and tap Shurikai to draw 2 cards, then discard a card. Then create a 1/1 colorless pilot creature token that crews vehicles as though its power were 2 greater. At face value, Shurikai is a card advantage engine that allows you to filter through your cards, produce tokens for fodder, and eventually can be crewed into a large beatstick to push for commander damage. With 8 power, Shurikai only needs to hit a player 3 times to kill them in non-commander games. And that's assuming no equipment or the like that buffs it. However, what makes Shurikai even more promising as a commander is the resource it has in combo lines. Specifically, Shurikai works well when paired with Polymorph, a spell that essentially exiles a creature and replaces it with the first creature reveal on the top of your deck. Combo decks built around Polymorph simply run no creatures beyond the game-ending threats and use creature tokens to cast Polymorph. Shurikai's pilot tokens serve the fodder role and help Shurikai's decks find Hullbreaker Horror, which can bounce a permanent whenever you cast a spell. As long as you have artifacts that tap for more mana than they cost, you can alternate one and tap it for mana, then cast the other one to bounce the tap one back and get more mana. You repeat until you have infinite mana, then filter it into a color using a colored mana rock, or just start the combo with Mox Opal. From there, once you have infinite colored mana, you can use Shurikai to draw and then bounce it with another spell to refresh the tap ability. You can then draw through your entire deck to find a win through a variety of different means. A Shurikai deck can grind through the early game with its ability until finding enough mana rocks for the combo and then explode from there. While weak to artifact hate like Collector Oof, the fact that your commander isn't always a creature does help it dodge most forms of removal. It also means your board wipes will usually not hit your commander, since you decide when it is or isn't a creature. Vehicles aren't a permanent type you typically see as a commander, and while Shurikai may be abnormal, it certainly is a potent commander that can attack aggressively, control the grind game, and present a combo kill when given the chance. And at number 7, we have Obnixilis Captive Kingpin. This legendary demon costs 2 generic, 1 black, and 1 red mana, and has 4 power and 3 toughness. Obnixilis has flying, which prevents it from being blocked except by creatures with flying or reach, as well as trample, which deals excess combat damage to the defending player. Whenever one or more opponents lose exactly 1 life, put a +1/+1 counter on itself. Then exile the top card of your library, and until your next end step you may play that card. Much like Rysson Star and Kellamorph, Obnixilis cares about pings of exactly 1 damage. Instead of amplifying that damage, however, it makes your commander stronger and gives you some temporary card advantage. It's also notable that Obnixilis doesn't count just damage, but any loss of life, meaning that paying life for Scalding Tarn or any other fetch land will trigger Obnixilis. These incidental instances of 1 damage add up, especially alongside dedicated sources of pinging like Pyrohemia. Notably, this also opens up some win conditions unique to Obnixilis, such as his 2-card infinite combo with All Will Be One. Whenever you put a counter on a permanent, All Will Be One pings someone or something for exactly 1 damage. This means as long as you trigger Obnixilis once, his gaining a counter will trigger All Will Be One, which will deal 1 damage, and then give Obnixilis another counter, repeating until every opponent is dead. Obnixilis, even when not going for the combo, whittles away your opponent's life totals and keeps up constant pressure. Cards like Kitteric Parasite punish opponents at every turn while putting you even further ahead on cards. Even though your pings are all 1 damage at a time, they can add up quickly, especially when combined with swings from Obnixilis with multiple counters on it. While there are other commanders in the colors that helm similar decks, Obnixilis punishes the table and rewards you for doing so enough that it's seen success in casual and competitive commander pods. And at number 6, we have Winota, Joiner of Forces. This legendary human warrior costs 2 generic, 1 red, and 1 white mana, and has 4 power and toughness. Whenever a non-human creature you control attacks, look at the top 6 cards of your library. You may put a human creature card from among them onto the battlefield tapped and attacking. It gains indestructible until end of turn. Put the rest of the cards on the bottom of your library in a random order. In constructed formats where Winota saw success, she was generally used to cheat heavy-hitting, high mana value humans into play. While this is certainly the case in Commander as well to a degree, she generally sees play more for her ability to help swarm the field with potent stack pieces in a way that's hard to interact with. Since Winota's ability puts creatures onto the battlefield without casting them or the like, there's no real window for your opponent to interact with some cards. Say your opponent is holding up a counterspell for your threat, and you go to combat and use Winota to reveal a Grand Abolisher. Doing so will get Abolisher on the board and prevent your opponent from casting spells without ever getting them an opportunity to counter Abolisher. Similar tricks can be done with Sanctum Prelate, which makes Winota even more threatening than combat step. Red-white decks in Commander often lack the card advantage that other color combinations have easy access to. Winota's ability to dig deep into the deck and pull out specific humans cheats both on mana and gives you some rather hefty levels of card selection. While far from perfect and still with its own weaknesses, Winota decks are resilient and explosive with enough creatures to gum up the works and eventually turn the tide of the game, or buy time for a Zealous Conscripts combo win. And at number 5, we have Edric, Spymaster of Trest. This legendary elf rogue costs 1 generic, 1 green, and 1 blue mana, and has 2 power and toughness. Whenever a creature deals combat damage to one of your opponents, its controller may draw a card. A player more accustomed to 1 versus 1 magic might simply read this ability so that your creatures draw a card whenever you attack your opponent. And while this is true, the real strength of Edric comes from his ability working with your opponents too. While it may seem problematic to draw your opponent's cards so freely, in practice it takes a lot of pressure off of you, especially in the early and mid games. Drawing a card is lucrative to a point where most players will divert their creatures away from you and towards your other opponents. By pushing aggression naturally away from you, you're able to preserve your own life total and creatures while everyone else is throwing themselves at each other. Edric decks also have access to evasive threats like Cold-Eyed Selkie, which will often get in unblocked and keep your hand full at almost all times. Edric's power comes from your ability to leverage table politics, working with your opponents and playing them against each other. With the help of counterspells and other interactions to prevent anyone from going for their own win, you're able to slowly grind the table down out of life and resources until eventually you're the only one left remaining. There's always a certain risk to playing Edric, but even if your opponents don't attack each other, that just means he becomes a one-sided card draw engine in your favor. He's always going to provide you cards and will almost always make combat far more frequent at every stage of the game. He's not the strongest commander on this list, but remains a popular choice several years after his printing, and one of the most politically demanding options for commander one could pick. And at number 4, we have Niv-Mizzet Perrin. This legendary dragon wizard costs 3 blue, 3 red, and has 5 power and toughness. He cannot be countered and has the aforementioned keyword ability, Flying. Whenever you draw a card, Niv-Mizzet Perrin deals 1 damage to any target, and whenever a player casts an instant or sorcery spell, you draw a card. While his mana value is somewhat unwieldy, cards like Jeweled Lotus make turboing into him not unreasonable. Once on the battlefield, he's difficult to remove in part because most Niv Mizzet decks are loaded to the brim with cheap counter magic. Since he draws a card whenever any player casts an instant or sorcery, if an opponent casts a spell, it will trigger Niv Mizzet and draw a card that might counter that spell. If two other players get into interaction war fighting over a spell or permanent, the Niv Mizzet player will draw off all of their spells despite no direct involvement. All of this makes Niv Mizzet a potent commander in its own right, but the pinging alongside it makes him borderline oppressive. Not only can the pings check mana dorks and other problematic permanents, but it can also serve as a proper win condition. Tandem Lookout, or another curiosity effect that makes the creature draw a card when they deal damage, is an infinite combo with Niv Mizzet. Whenever Niv Mizzet deals damage, it will trigger to draw a card, which in turn triggers Niv Mizzet to ping for another damage. You can then shoot down your opponent as you draw through your entire deck. This is a combo that's hard to disrupt without counter magic, since if you can cast removal to try and kill Niv Mizzet, if the removal was an instant or sorcery, that will trigger Niv Mizzet and just start the combo up again on its own. It's hard to justify running a high mana value commander without it offering up a lot in return, and Niv Mizzet Perrin does so in spades. With enough interaction and spells to cast, it's easy to ride Niv Mizzet throughout the turn cycles until you can secure your win. And at number 3, we have the Gitrog monster. This legendary frog horror costs 3 generic, 1 black, and 1 green mana, and has 6 power and toughness. It has Death Touch, which means any amount of damage it deals is enough to deal lethal damage to another creature. At the beginning of your upkeep, sacrifice the Gitrog monster unless you sacrifice a land. And whenever 1 or more lands are put into your graveyard from anywhere, draw a card. You may play an additional land on each of your turns. While this card does have a drawback, the extra land drop it provides, along with the card draw, allows you to leverage that downside into an advantage engine. Ramming up Excavator and similar effects that allow you to play lands from your graveyard let you draw cards without ever falling behind on mana advantage thanks to your commander. But even beyond that, Gitrog rewards land decks in a way that is subtle at a glance, yet potent. Fetch lands sacrifice themselves, and as such, draw a card with Gitrog, making already powerful lands even more potent. But what sets Gitrog apart from any other lands matter commander is the sheer combo potential the card has. It's not hard to draw your entire deck thanks to the card Dakmor Salvage, a land with the ability Dredge. Dredge allows you to replace an instance of drawing a card with a milling cards equal to the card's Dredge value, then putting that card in your graveyard into your hand. If you have a discard outlet, you can discard Dakmor Salvage, which will then trigger Gitrog. Replace the draw with Dakmor Salvage Dredge and then mill 2 cards. If you hit at least 1 land, you'll put another Gitrog draw trigger on the stack and can discard Dakmor Salvage in response, which will then trigger Gitrog. And if you don't hit a land, just discard Dakmor Salvage to your discard outlet, which will then allow you to try again with another Gitrog trigger until you do hit a land. Once you do this, the most recent draw trigger resolves and you replace it with Dredge, putting Dakmor Salvage back in your hand, repeating the process, netting a draw trigger in the process. Combined with cards that reshuffle the graveyard back into the library when they're put into the graveyard, like the original Eldrazi Titans, and a Gitrog deck can empty their library, eventually drawing everything and go for wins even at an instant speed. The deck is so full of combo lines and potential value that it's able to abuse the cleanup step. When you discard to hand size, if you discard a land, that will trigger Gitrog to draw a card, which will then make you discard back to hand size. As long as you keep having lands in hand to discard, you can essentially use your cleanup step to filter through draws and sculpt your hand. Gitrog is a green-black commander who is fairly unique in function and application. There's no other commander quite like him, and will likely as such remain a facet of the format for quite some time. And at number 2, we have Yuriko Tiger Shadow. This legendary human ninja costs 1 generic, 1 blue, and 1 black mana, and has 1 power and 3 toughness. It also has the ability Commander Ninjutsu. For 1 blue and 1 black mana, you can return any unblocked attacker you control to hand and put this card into the battlefield from your hand or commander zone tapped and attacking. Whenever a ninja you control deals combat damage to a player, reveal the top card of your library and put that card into your hand. Each opponent loses life equal to the card's mana value. Commander Ninjutsu completely circumvents commander tax, meaning that no matter how many times Yuriko is resolved, as long as you Ninjutsu her in, she'll cost 2 mana. And ideally, you'll want to Ninjutsu her in anyways, since the most reliable way to trigger her ability is to attack with an unblockable creature that can then switch out for her. There are enough 1 mana creatures that have some form of evasion that decks can consistently get Yuriko out on turn 2. From there, not only does her ability provide advantage, but the damage adds up fast. Top deck manipulation like Brainstorm is even more powerful when you can stack your highest mana value spells back on top of your deck before attacking with a ninja. Competitive Commander generally uses low mana value spells. However, there are multiple spells with high mana values that have alternate or even free mana costs. While Force of Will almost always be free to cast, it will still count for 5 life for each opponent. Yuriko circumvents one of the major rules of Commander via her ninjutsu, and with clever deck building and stacking, can make for devastating turns. especially since Yuriko is known for taking extra turns, leading to devastating wins where she reveals Temporal Trespass and deals 12 damage to everyone before taking an extra turn. Yuriko can grind with her ninjas and the card advantage they provide, and snap on a dime with the extra turns, or even combo win with Demonic Consultation. And while there's no denying Yuriko is one of the most powerful 2-color commanders ever printed, there's one commander who is just a bit more over the top. And finally, our number 1 commander is Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. This legendary human druid costs 1 green and 1 blue, and has 2 power and toughness. Whenever you tap a non-land permanent for mana, add 1 mana of any type that permanent produced. You may pay 5 generic, 1 green and 1 blue mana to look at the top 5 cards of your library, and put a non-human creature card from among them onto the battlefield, then put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. Kinnan covers multiple abilities that are highly sought after in Commander. Not only does Kinnan ramp your mana in a way that's good in the early game, but also easy to combo with. Kinnan is also a built-in outlet for that mana. A card like Basalt Monolith that taps for 3 mana and can be untapped for 3 mana becomes a reputable source of infinite colorless mana alongside Kinnan, since it now produces 4 mana and can net you 1 mana even after paying to untap it. Since Kinnan works with any non-land permanent's mana production, you can enchant a mana dork with Freed from the Real and generate infinite mana of any color. Once you have that mana, you can use Kinnan to pull all the non-human creatures out of your deck and onto the battlefield. This will usually include Thrasios Triton Hero, who can then draw through the rest of your deck and get you to a win. Kinnan is an explosive commander whose low mana value and simple 2-card mana combos can put you ahead, if not outright win you the game in the first few turns of the game. Kinnan is basically always threatening putting together a winning board with just a few more pieces, and is a commander that requires constant attention. While there's no overt best commander, it's hard to argue that Kinnan isn't one of the most prolific 2-color commanders ever since its introduction to Ikoria layer behemoths. While there are no shortages of other blue-green commanders that could wind up on this list in their own right, they're not quite as potent as Kinnan. Blue and green are arguably the best colors in Commander, giving the deck access to the best ramp and counter magic in the format. It's hard to argue against a commander who represents both half an infinite mana combo and an outlet for that mana at the same time, which is why Kinnan earns its spot here at the top of the list. 3-color decks in Commander often find success in the format given their access to a wide variety of colors without getting as greedy on mana fixing as 4 or 5-color decks. Given the lack of a structured meta and the wide variety of options for what your commander is, it's subjective to say what commanders are the best in the format. In this case, we're looking at both statistics of how many deck lists for these commanders exist, as well as their success at more competitive tables to determine what 3-color commanders are the best in the format. And starts off at number 10, we have Roko Carburetti Caterer. This legendary elf druid costs X generic, 1 red, 1 green, and 1 white mana, and has 3 power and 1 toughness. When Roko enters the battlefield, if you cast it, you may search your library for a creature with mana value X or less and put it onto the battlefield. This ability essentially makes Roko into a Chord of Calling type effect that can search up any creature from your deck as long as you have enough mana. Green is known for its ability to ramp mana, especially in the Commander format. As such, it's not difficult to get enough mana to make Roko a relevant creature. While many decks aim to build around their commander's ability, Roko instead does the opposite, allowing your deck have all sorts of abilities Roko can then search for. As such, Roko decks in Commander often run various compact infinite creature combos to try and win the game with. If you happen to draw a specific combo piece, such as Karmic Guide, you can then use Roko to search up a card that goes infinite with it. This offers Roko decks an explosive angle that many other decks lack, where your commander represents a wide variety of game-ending threats. Commander, especially at high levels of play, is defined and dominated by searching the deck for the specific cards you need. Redundancy is the name of the game in competitive Commander, and as such, Roko has risen quickly to be one of the best red, green, white commanders in the format. Beyond just being able to tutor at win conditions, Roko is able to search whatever specific answer you might need given the board state. While most Commander decks run removal in some capacity, Roko decks make the removal all the easier to access when it's tied to creatures. Roko, of course, isn't perfect as a commander. To repeatedly search further cards, you'll have to recast Roko and thus pay even more for command tax each time. But having access to a creature toolbox that gives you whatever answers you need when you need them as long as you have the mana for it shores up the weaknesses the commander has. Creature combo decks will only get better with time as more potential combo pieces get printed, and as such, Roko's place in the format will only grow with time. And at number 9, we have Hinata, Dawn Crowned. This legendary Kirin Spirit costs 1 generic, 1 blue, 1 red, and 1 white mana, and has 4 power and 4 toughness. Hinata also has the keyword abilities Flying and Trample. The former allows it to only be blocked by creatures with Flying and Reach. The latter keyword makes it so any damage over lethal it deals to a creature is dealt to that creature's controller. Both of these keywords do very little to push Hinata towards being so popular and playable. Instead, Hinata's strength comes from its interaction with targeting spells. Spells you cast cost 1 generic mana less to cast for each target that spell has, and spells your opponent casts cost 1 more to cast for each target. In some ways, this effect is very similar to classic commander Grand Arbiter Augustin IV, who makes your spells cheaper while taxing your opponents. This tax effect is especially potent in competitive commander, where most target interaction is chosen specifically because it's free to cast, and players need to be as mana efficient as possible. So any sort of built-in tax effect will assist a commander in being playable. But Hinata's real strength lies in its cost down effect. Specifically, Hinata interacts very favorably with spells with X in their mana cost, where X also determines how many targets the spell has. A key example of this is the sorcery Curse of the Swine, which costs X generic mana and 2 blue mana and exiles X target creatures and creates a 2 power and toughness board creature token to take its place. Curse of Swine normally requires a heavy amount of mana to remove multiple creatures. However, since each additional target makes the spell cost 1 more generic mana, and Hinata's ability makes the spell cost 1 generic mana less for each target, you essentially only have to pay the 2 blue mana, then the generic X cost pays for itself. This turns a card like Curse of Swine into a 2 mana mass exile effect that can clear away every notable creature your opponent has. Even spells that don't have X costs work favorably with Hinata, as long as they have multiple targets, meaning that a card like Sublime Epiphany go from being balanced by their high mana cost to being massive swings in tempo and advantage. Hinata's ability can even go infinite with the right cards, such as the X cost spell Reality Spasm that can tap or untap X target permanents. You can use this to untap every permanent you control, including all your lands and any mana producing artifacts you might have. Then all you need is some way to repeatedly recur the Reality Spasm, such as Soulfire Grandmaster, which can put Reality Spasm back into your hand as it resolves. This not only nets you infinite mana, but also infinite spell cast and thus by extension, infinite storm count. Hinata's ability to make powerful yet expensive spells cheaper to cast while hindering your opponent just enough has founded a niche both in competitive and casual tables. It has led to being one of the most popular commanders in its color identity, despite being such a relatively recent card at the time of this video. And at number 8, we have Nekuzar the Mind Razor. This legendary zombie wizard costs 2 generic, 1 blue, 1 black, and 1 red mana, and has 2 power and 4 toughness. At the beginning of each player's draw step, that player draws an additional card. Whenever an opponent draws a card, Nekuzar deals 1 damage to that player. Nekuzar's first ability functions in a way similar to Howling Mind type effects, where each player gets an extra draw on their turn. These effects have sort of existed since the early days of Magic. And as long as there have been ways to force opponents to draw cards, there have been decks built to punish them for doing so. Nekuzar supports this directly with his second ability, pinging your opponent for 1 damage every time they draw, no matter the reason. This death by 1,000 cuts method of damage would put pressure on your opponent throughout the whole game as they draw through their deck. However, what makes Nekuzar such a popular commander and the most built commander in its color identity is the ease by which you can turn Nekuzar's pinging into a machine gun of damage. This is most consistently done via Wheel of Fortune effects that force players to discard their hands and then draw a new one. Drawing a whole new 7 cards off of a wheel comes with 7 damage from Nekuzar. Not to mention the fact you no longer have the cards in your hand you had previously. Given the sheer number of search effects in Commander that add to the hand, it's not unlikely that using a wheel can actively remove a tutored up card before its controller even gets to properly use it. These decks also tend to run other ways to punish drawing and discarding beyond Nekuzar himself, utilizing enchantments like Megrim to deal even more damage. Nekuzar decks aim to churn through each player's deck as fast as possible, disrupting hands and forcing everyone to draw as many cards as possible to attempt and kill them. The Nekuzar player has control over when wheels are cast and what sorts of effects they deploy, which most of the actively damaging effects being entirely symmetrical. So Nekuzar is able to refill its hand and keep drawing as much as it would like, whereas the other players are just completely at their mercy. Nekuzar decks aim to take over the table, sometimes even relying on enchanting Nekuzar with Pheresis to give him fact and making it so instead of dealing damage, he doles out poison counters to your opponent. Then opponents will die after 10 draws, since that will net them 10 poison counters. Nekuzar was initially printed in the 2013 Commander decks and has remained the top commander in his color identity ever since. Wheel effects keep getting printed, as well as even more ways to punish draw effects. And at number 7, we have Thalia in the Gitrog Monster. This legendary human frog horror costs 1 generic, 1 white, 1 black, and 1 green mana, and has 4 power and toughness. It also has the 2 keywords First Strike and Death Strike. First Strike makes it so it deals damage first in combat, and Death Strike makes it so any amount of damage is lethal to a creature in combat. This combination of keywords makes it so that, unless the creature Thalia is in combat with against also has First Strike, she will kill that creature and not take any damage herself, thanks to the creature dying before it got a chance to properly deal its combat damage. This alone makes Thalia and the Gitrog Monster a real threat in combat, and an unfavorable block for most creatures in the game. Beyond these abilities, Thalia and the Gitrog Monster also allows you to play an extra land on each of your turns. Creatures and non-basic lands your opponents control also enter the battlefield tapped, and whenever Thalia and the Gitrog monster attacks, you sacrifice a creature or land and then draw a card. This commander aims to combine the mechanics and playstyles of two already existing legendary creatures, specifically pairing the Gitrog monster and the mechanical stylings of Thalia. The Gitrog monster has been one of the most successful competitive commanders since its initial printing, given its sheer combo potential. And while this new deck lacks that sheer combo potential, it makes up for it in the sheer value it provides. This card is far less all-in than the Gitrog monster, which forces you to sacrifice a land every turn, instead only allowing you to sacrifice lands when you have the ability to do so comfortably. Thalia and the Gitrog monster still benefit from the wealth of land support that exists in the game, but focus on a more grindy, advantage-based game. Calling back to Thalia Heretics Cathar's tap-down ability, this commander is able to not only limit blockers by having new creatures enter tapped, but it actively slows down your opponent by making the lands enter tapped as well. Competitive Commander is dominated by 4 and 5 color decks that run little to no basic lands at all. This means Thalia and the Gitrog monster will force pretty much every land your opponent plays to enter tapped, leaving them behind on mana as you continue to develop your own board and get card advantage via attacking with your commander. From there, you can grind out with powerful creatures and land synergies until overtaking the game entirely. Even within a few months of its printing in March of Machines, it became one of the most popular commanders in its color identity, in part because of how popular land decks are. And even beyond the land synergies Thalia and the Gitrog monster offers enough flexibility and power in its abilities that all sorts of strategies, both casual and competitive, could consider running it. And at number 6, we have Isshin, 2 Heavens is 1. This legendary human samurai costs 1 red, 1 white, and 1 black mana, and has 3 power and 4 toughness. Isshin's abilities make it so if a creature attacking causes a triggered ability or a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. Doubling triggered abilities has been a powerful effect for years, with cards such as Panharmonicon winding up as commander staples for just how much extra value these extra triggers can add. While Panharmonicon specifically copies Enter the Battlefield effects, Isshin instead focuses on rewarding decks that aim to be more aggressive. Assuming your creatures survive combat, they stick around to keep triggering their abilities on multiple turns, meaning that Isshin in the long run can eke out more value than a card like Panharmonicon when built around. Isshin decks aim to swarm the board with small creatures with relevant attack triggers that Isshin can copy. There are many creatures that make opponents lose life equal to the number of attacking creatures, and attacking with multiple instances of this effect that are then doubled by Isshin can wind up dealing massive amounts of damage to each opponent before blockers are even declared. Considering just how many attack triggers have been printed throughout Magic's history, Isshin decks have no shortage of options for filling out their slots. It's important to note that it's not just creatures whose abilities can be doubled by Isshin. As long as it's an ability you control triggered by a creature attacking, Isshin will double it. This means an enchantment like Fervent Charge will trigger twice and give it +2 power and toughness to buff every attacking creature 2 times. What really causes Isshin to get out of hand, however, is when used in combination with extra combat triggers such as those from Aurelia the War Leader. Isshin decks can explode with value off the back of these triggers, which is part of why Isshin has become so popular so quickly. Despite only being printed in Kamigawa and Neo Dynasty, the card has exploded in popularity, and is currently within EDHREC's top 10 most popular commanders at the time of recording. The only thing that holds Isshin back from being higher on this list, despite its sudden popularity, is the fact that it has not made much of a splash in competitive group on the level that other commanders on this list have. And at number 5, we have Tasigur the Golden Fanged. This legendary human costs 5 generic and 1 black mana and has 4 power and 5 toughness. Tasigur also has the keyword ability Delve, which allows you to exile cards from your graveyard while casting the spell, to pay 1 generic mana the spell's cost for each card exiled. You may pay 2 generic and then 2 of either green or blue, thanks to the cost of the 2 hybrid mana, to mill 2 cards. Then return a non-land card of your opponent's choice from your graveyard to your hand. Part of what makes Tasigur so effective as a commander is having Delve in the first place. Delve can reduce the generic cost of a commander, meaning that as long as you have cards exiled from your graveyard, you can cast Tasigur for a single black mana even late into the game. This is made all the more potent when considering how Delve actively makes Tasigur's activated ability stronger. Since your opponent gets to choose which non-land card to put back into your hand, they'll have free range to try and give you the worst potential card from your graveyard for the current situation. Tasigur's Delve ability allows you to exile away irrelevant cards before your opponent has a chance to force them back into your hand. While you rarely have full control over the exact choice your opponent can make, it's certainly not hard to make it so your opponent has very little option but to give you the card you want. That said, however, the multiplayer nature of Commander offers a Tasigur player arguably even more control than one might expect. A common line of play for a Tasigur player is to essentially police the table and check all other players' threats by rebuying the same counterspells and removal spells over and over again. If one player plays a scary threat, the Tasigur player can activate their commander and ask one of the other players to give them back a counterspell so they can stop it. By pointing the interaction at a different player, the player you ask is far more likely to give you the card you want in that situation. In this way, Tasigur decks have an increased ability to grind as well as essentially always threatening interaction as long as they have the mana available. Tasigur as a commander requires more deal making and negotiating than the average commander, but in doing so can outlast even some of the grindiest decks. Tasigur's main home is in the competitive format, where the levels of must-answer threats are so high that a Tasigur player may be relied on to keep the game from ending multiple times a turn cycle. If there was any point against Tasigur, it would be the prominence of other, arguably more popular commanders within its color identity. But while Muldrotha the Gravetide may be more popular by play percentage, Tasigur's popularity alongside its competitive pedigree earns it a spot on this list. And at number 4, we have Tivit, Seller of Secrets. This legendary Sphinx rogue costs 3 generic, 1 white, 1 blue, and 1 black mana, and has 6 power and toughness. Tivit has the keyword ability Flying as well as Ward 3. Ward makes it so whenever Tivit is targeted with a spell or an ability an opponent controls, it is countered unless they pay 3 generic mana for the ward cost. Tivit also has the ability Council's Dilemma, which triggers whenever he enters the battlefield or attacks. When it triggers, each player, starting with you, votes for evidence or bribery. For each evidence vote, you investigate, which creates a clue token that allows you to pay 2 mana and sacrifice it to draw a card. For each bribery vote, create a treasure token which can be tapped and sacrificed for 1 mana of any color. Tivit also has an ability to give you an additional vote while voting, meaning that with a full pot of 4 commander players, each Council's Dilemma trigger will net you 5 artifact tokens. Generally speaking, your opponents will almost always give you clue tokens considering how powerful treasure tokens are. But even then, your own votes will net you treasure tokens to use for mana production. More importantly, however, these 5 artifact tokens just so happen to give you enough artifacts to tap and activate Time Sieve, which will give you an extra turn for doing so. This means Tivit and Time Sieve can take effectively infinite turns as long as you have opponents. Since each time Tivit attacks, you'll generate enough artifact tokens for another extra turn. While this is not a true infinite, since eventually one of your opponents will die to commander damage and thus only generate 4 artifacts with an ability trigger, there are ways to still win off the back of this. If you get all of your opponents down to 1 more swing until losing to commander damage, and then have a few mana rocks or other stray artifacts to sacrifice, you can get just enough turns to clear the table. Time Sieve can even sacrifice itself for that very last activation. And this is just the win condition with Tivit that requires the least cards. Including Academy Manufactor will make every vote produce a treasure, clue, and an additional food token as well, and finding ways to flicker Tivit will also allow you to get more tokens. Tivit has found success in competitive commander even in spite of its high mana value because of its strong color identity and access to compact combo lines. Even when not used for a combo, the clue tokens and treasure tokens provide further card advantage and ways to use those cards. Tivit checks pretty much every box for a strong commander, and has quickly become one of the most dominant choices for its color identity. And at number 3, we have Chulane, Teller of Tales. This legendary human druid costs 2 generic, 1 green, 1 white, and 1 blue mana, and has 2 power and 4 toughness. The keyword ability Vigilance makes it so Chulane does not tap to attack. Chulane also has triggered abilities whenever you cast a creature spell that allows you to draw a card, and then you may put a land from your hand onto the battlefield. You may also pay 3 generic mana and tap Chulane to return target creature you control to its owner's hand. The power of Chulane comes from just how quickly he can snowball advantage. Small creatures like mana dorks tend to lose out on value in the mid to late game, yet with Chulane on board become cantrips that replace themselves with the card drawn off the triggered ability. Chulane decks can then use the mana dorks to cast even more small creatures and draw more cards and grow their board states exponentially faster than opponents. This is especially true that Chulane gives you extra land drops, meaning you not only develop your mana even more, but can also trigger other abilities such as landfall. Chulane can even return creatures to hand not only to recast them for further value, but to save your creatures from removal. Chulane can return himself to the hand, meaning you don't have to worry about the commander tax as much as other commanders that draw as much heat. And Chulane is certainly a high-level threat commander given how generically powerful he is. He's seen success at all levels of play simply because a creature-focused or land-focused deck in his color can arguably run well, if not better, with him as the commander. This has led to Chulane finding a strong niche in competitive commander. Creature-based combos provide varied win cons for these Chulane decks that can leverage card and mana advantage while developing their board with hate bears and other creature-based threats. Chulane was printed in the Brawl format pre-constructed decks, which received some flack for printing cards that were arguably too generically powerful for Commander in the eyes of some. While this is by no means a universal consensus, nothing in Commander ever will be. There are some that have argued Chulane's so good as a commander, he's actively bad for the format. And while that's entirely subjective, what's less subjective is that Tulane isn't even the most infamous Brawl Precon commander. And at number 2, we have Corvald, Fey Cursed King. This legendary Dragon Noble costs 2 generic, 1 black, 1 red, and 1 green mana, and has 4 power and toughness. Beyond having the keyword ability Flying, Corvald has a triggered ability whenever he enters the battlefield or attacks that makes you sacrifice another permanent. His second triggered ability gives him a +1/+1 counter and draws you a card whenever you sacrifice a permanent. This means that while Corvald does technically eat up your own permanents, he replaces those permanents as well. And any downsides that come from needing to sacrifice a permanent to have a mentor or attack are offset by just how valuable drawing cards on sacrificed permanents can be. While Tivit earlier could generate plenty of treasure tokens, with Corvald, any treasure tokens you make also provide card advantage. Format staples like the fetch lands, which sacrifice themselves to grab other lands from the deck, provide even more value and keep your hand full as you play through your turns. This, combined with the fact that Corvald gets bigger with each sacrifice, it's not long before Corvald is threatening lethal commander damage in just a few swings. Sacrifice themes have been popular and supported in Magic for years, and Corvald takes an already potent strategy and supercharges it. In competitive Commander, Corvald provides both a threat and an engine to find the various high-impact cards that red-black decks rely on in the format, such as Underworld Breach. Much like Tulane, there's a level of genericness that propels Corvald so high. Even without being all in on sacrificing themes, a deck can have enough incidental cheap ways of sacrificing things to find use for Corvald. While Tulane had some competition for the most popular commander in his color identity, Corvald is instead far and away the most currently popular commander of his colors. At a more casual level, it's hard to argue that Corvald isn't the strongest sacrifice commander around, given just how powerful his ability is when left to its own devices. Even though Corvald is a dominant face-up commander in its own right, it's not nearly as iconic to the format as another commander, who has managed to maintain its level of popularity since the beginning of Wizards even recognizing the format. And finally, at number 1 on our list, we have Animar, Soul of Elements. This legendary elemental costs 1 green, 1 blue, and 1 red mana, and has 1 power and toughness. Animar has protection from white and black, which means it cannot be damaged, enchanted, blocked, or targeted by cards of those colors. Whenever you cast a creature spell, Animar gets +1/+1 counter, and all creature spells you cast cost 1 generic mana less to cast for each +1/+1 counter on Animar. This ability starts off as fairly unassuming, but then snowballs into being outright oppressive. Animar decks can make just about any creature work after casting enough small creatures. But the real strength comes from casting creatures that specifically are colorless. It doesn't take long for Ornithopter of Paradise to not only become free to cast, but then in the process make even more artifact creatures now free. This allows Animar decks to storm out creatures as fast as they can draw them, and when paired with the Great Henge style effect can often lead to turns where you play through most of your deck. Animar even has access to fairly unique combo lines with cards such as Ancestral Statue, which returns any permanent you control to hand when it enters the battlefield. Since it can return itself, that means Ancestral Statue can just be cast for free an infinite amount of times. Even without relying solely on colorless creatures, this makes game-ending threats cost only as much as the colorless mana pips on them. Caterhoof Behemoth is powerful at 8 mana, let alone when it only costs 3 green mana to cast. Animar was printed in the first official Commander pre-constructed decks. Funnily enough, Animar was not the face commander. Instead, only winded up as one of the extra cards included in the Riku of the Two Reflections deck. While Riku is by no means a bad commander, Animar quickly rose to prominence as the premier commander in its color identity. Today, Animar is no longer the top-rated teamwork colored commander in the terms of EDHREC's metrics, but is high enough and has existed long enough that its spot in the format is undeniable. It's especially helpful that the 2 most common colors for removal in Commander, white and black, are the 2 colors that Animar cannot be targeted by. Many of the cards in this list have been from the recent years of design. Despite being from the first ever Commander product, Animar remains not just playable, but a notable part of the format in casual and competitive play alike. 5 color commanders are fairly popular given they allow your commander deck access to every color, and thus the widest potential card pool. While many of the available 5 color legendary creatures are somewhat niche, there are some that have risen to prominence within the commander format. So today we'll be going over 10 of the most prolific and powerful 5 color commanders. Starting us off at number 10, we have Morophon the Boundless. This legendary shapeshifter costs 7 generic mana and has 6 power and toughness. The keyword Changeling makes it so Morophon counts as all creature types, and when it enters the battlefield, you choose one specific creature type. Spells of that creature type cost 1 less of each color of mana to cast it, although this effect only reduces the amount of colored mana you pay. Creatures of this chosen creature type gain +1 power and toughness. As an example, Sigarda, Host of Herons, costs 2 generic, 1 green, and 2 white mana. But if you had Morophon that selected Angels, then you'd only need to pay 2 generic and 1 white mana to cast Sigarda. So for those unaware, color identity for commanders is based on all mana symbols on the card. So even though Morophon's casting cost is generic, the cost down ability technically makes him a 5 color commander. Beyond that, this cost down effect encourages playing cards that cost different colors but have minimal generic costs, which plays directly into the sorts of decks that Morophon was designed to support. Morophon exists as almost a catch-all commander for any Kindred strategy. Since Morophon is always all creature types, it benefits from any and all Kindred support, and in turn offers a commander for decks that lack a proper Kindred commander, especially one in all 5 colors. A creature type such as Human will have legendaries like Rick, Steadfast Leader, which would make for a playable commander in their own right, but Rick, in this example, limits you to only plain white cards. But instead, playing Morophon, you can play literally any legal human in your deck, and also cast many for discounted costs, if not outright free. Morophon does not have an ability that specifically aids any one strategy, and instead is so generically passable that any Kindred deck could at least consider if Morophon offers anything for their deck. That said, this does not translate directly into a spot in the competitive sphere. Morophon, arguably more than any other commander on this list, is a casual card. It exists to help bolster Kindred decks like in support, and Kindred decks just aren't really a thing when measured up against what you'd find typically in competitive commander pots. A lack of other competitively relevant 5 color commanders, coupled with just how popular Morophon is for a variety of decks, is what ultimately lands Morophon on this list. Even if Kindred decks aren't competitive, they remain one of the most popular strategies in the format, with plenty of creature types still waiting for a commander to suit them best. And those left waiting will usually use Morophon in the meantime. And at number 9, we have Esika, God of the Tree. This legendary god costs 1 generic and 2 green mana, and has 1 power and 4 toughness. Esika has Vigilance, which means it can attack without tapping, and has an ability to tap itself to add 1 mana of any color. Other legendary creatures gain both of these abilities as well, meaning every legendary creature on the board can attack freely, then be held back to block or use for mana post-combat. This alone is a novel mana-fixing effect, but far from an exciting commander. Esika, however, has a backside, one that can be cast as an alternative to the creature at any point you could cast Esika herself. This enchantment is the Prismatic Bridge. At the beginning of your upkeep, it makes you reveal cards from the top of your library and to reveal a creature or planeswalker card, which you then put onto the battlefield. Then put the rest of the cards into the bottom of your library in a random order. This effect is prone to variance, but generally, Esika decks load up on powerful effects in hopes of slowly building up an impressive board. Esika, or rather the Prismatic Bridge, lends itself to good stuff piles, but can also be leveraged for more focused strategies. While she's by no means a major threat, some fringe competitive commander play with Esika playing the role of a stacks deck. Stacks is a control strategy built around shutting your opponent out of options. Many of the most powerful stacks options limit all players, making it hard to even do a basic action such as casting a spell. The Prismatic Bridge breaks parity by allowing you at least 1 creature or planeswalker for free each turn, while opponents struggle to get any permanents on board at all. This is, of course, just one way of playing Esika, and the real reason that she's become such a popular commander is the sheer variety of decks she can support. Flexibility of theme in the form of powerful effects is perhaps the biggest draw to the commander, especially for the more casual-oriented. She can cheat out practically any creature or planeswalker in the game thanks to bearing all 5 colors, meaning there's no telling what the Prismatic Bridge might reveal until it's too late. This is what makes Esika so popular in casual play, since you'll maximize the number of splashy permanents on your field. In particular, Planeswalker-focused decks, otherwise known as Super Friends, are popular for her since she gives you access to all of them and can play even the most expensive ones for free. Just be sure not to include a copy of Phage the Untouchable unless you really want to live on the edge each turn. And at number 8, we have Ululek, Fused Atrocity. This legendary Eldrazi costs 1 hybrid colorless mana of each color, and it has 2 power and 5 toughness, as well as the keyword Devoid, which makes it so that gameplay purposes, Ululek has no color. Whenever you cast an Eldrazi spell, you may pay 2 colorless mana, and if you do, copy all spells you control, then all other activated and triggered abilities you control, and you may choose new targets for those copies. On a casual level, this opens the door to double up on any of your big splashy Eldrazi, like It That Betrays, or abuse some cast triggers, which many powerful Eldrazi have. Eldrazi have always been a popular theme, and Ululek was their first and most prominent 5-color commander. But what earns it a spot on this list over the likes of Azlas the Swailing Scourge is Ululek's higher potential in competitive pods. While you're only allowed to use Ululek's ability when you cast an Eldrazi spell, it copies all spells and abilities you currently control. This means if you cast an instance such as Tainted Pact, then flash it in Eldrazi like Dimensional Infiltrator, then activate Ululek, you copy Tainted Pact as well. This synergy gets even more powerful when combined with a way to reuse Ululek's ability multiple times. Creatures like Delnay, Streetwise Lookout outright copy the triggered ability and can set up even more outrageous combos. Ululek isn't able to copy mana abilities, but can make use of something like Voltaic Key to untap a mana rock. You can add in an activation of Voltaic Key to your stack before resolving Ululek's trigger. This will give you 2 Voltaic Key abilities. You'll be able to use those to untap a mana rock that taps for enough, like a Mana Vault, to repeatedly pay for Ululek's ability and pay for the Voltaic Key, and basically full control of the stack. Ululek is a very complicated commander with lots of powerful use cases and applications in both competitive and casual. Casual in particular makes the most of Ululek's ability, often drawing your opponent into a backbreaking Eldrazi, while still threatening the same complex level of stack manipulation. The main reason it's this low on this list is that, at the time of writing, Ululek is such a new commander to the format that people have not had much time to properly explore the deck, let alone give the meta time to adjust. But between its casual Eldrazi builds and its more complicated competitive stack manipulation, Ululek is likely to be a mainstay in commander pods for years to come. And at number 7, we have Jensen Carthalion, Druid Exile. This legendary human druid costs 1 green and 1 white mana and has 2 power and toughness. Whenever you cast a multicolor spell, scry 1. And if that spell was all colors, you also create a 4 power and toughness angel creature token with flying and vigilance. You may also pay 5 mana of any color and tap Jensen to add 1 mana of each color. While Jensen's ability to make free Serra Angels every time you cast a 5-color spell is novel, and his color fixing is helpful, neither of these abilities are what really push Jensen into realms of playability. For many Jensen decks, especially those at a higher power level, he's hardly even your commander. This is because Jensen, thanks to commander color identity rules, is a 5-color commander whose mana value is just 2. This means you can have a 5-color commander deck with Loris the Dream Den. Loris is a legendary cat nightmare which costs 1 generic and 2 hybrid white-black mana, and has 3 power and 2 toughness and lifelink. Loris has the keyword companion, which means as long as you fulfill a certain requirement, you may put it into your hand from outside the game for 3 generic mana at sorcery speed. This essentially gives you a second commander, albeit one that's harder to get back if it's removed. In Loris's case, each permanent card in your starting deck must have a mana value of 2 or less if you wish to have it as your companion. The downside can be limiting as it keeps you from playing some notable staples, but in return, Loris provides a great deal of value. During each of your turns, you may cast 1 permanent spell with a mana value of 2 or less from your graveyard. Not only does this allow you to recover from removal, you're able to use cards like Mishra's Bauble as a card advantage engine. And since Loris only restricts the mana values of permanent cards, you're freely able to run a card like Ad Nauseam to facilitate winning the game. Ad Nauseam is particularly good in these Jensen decks since the deck's mana curve is naturally quite low, meaning every time Ad Nauseam gives you an extra card, you're likely to take only a few points of damage, if that. Jensen is a fascinating commander, partly because he himself is so unimportant to the deck. The mana fixing he provides can be occasionally helpful, but he's only really your commander because of what he allows you to run, rather than what he himself does. In fact, Jensen recently received some competition in the form of Ezio, another 5-color commander with a mana value of 2, who can occasionally knock out a problematic opponent a bit quicker than they otherwise would lose. Ezio is likely to be the more popular commander in the long run from a casual perspective, given the prevalence of kindred decks. However, Jensen isn't completely without a home in casual, since he is a great commander for multicolor matter decks when divorced from playing Loris. While Ezio may sneak its way into a lot more casual pods, Jensen is the more competitively slanted of the two, at least for now. Yet both remain novel ways to play a 5-color commander deck. And at number 6, we have the First Sliver. This legendary sliver costs 1 mana of each color and has 7 power and toughness. The First Sliver both has the keyword Cascade, but gives it to all Sliver spells you cast. Cascade, exile cards from the top of your library whenever you cast a spell with Cascade, until you exile a non-land card with a lower cost than the spell you cast. You may cast the spell you exiled without paying its mana cost, and put all the other exiled cards on the bottom of your library in a random order. Much like Ululek, the First Sliver does not earn its spot on this list due to its synergy for kindred decks. Sliver decks have other options for commanders they'll generally get more value from, like Sliver Gravemother. The first sliver usually proves a better fit in the 99, where it can help barf out even more slivers while your actual commander provides setup or recovery. When removed from the realm of casual kindred decks, however, the first sliver is a great win condition for a 5-colored food chain deck, which has given the card a home as a competitive commander. Food Chain is an enchantment that allows you to exile a creature to get X mana of any one color, where X is 1 plus exile creature's mana value. While you can only spend this mana to cast creature spells, there are still plenty of ways to abuse this. Some creatures, such as Eternal Scourge, can be cast from exile, meaning you can exile it to Food Chain and gain enough mana to cast it again and net 1 extra mana left over. You can repeat this process to gain infinite mana of every color, which is where the first sliver comes into play. You can repeatedly cast your commander with this infinite mana, cascading into a spell every time you do so. The first sliver decks tend to not run any spells with a mana value higher than 4, as to ensure they can go through their entire deck. It's just a matter of exiling your commander to Food Chain and recasting it again and again until you've cast every spell in your deck and can assemble a win with Thassa's Oracle or any other number of cards. The first sliver is far from the first commander to synergize with Food Chain, with cards like General Tazri filling similar niches. However, commanders like Tazri require other support to actually win with the outlet that can sometimes be convoluted. Meanwhile, the first sliver's cascade is straightforward, going through your entire deck spell by spell until you're near inevitable win. Food Chain is a classic strategy in competitive commander, and many consider the first sliver to be the definitive commander for the deck. But Food Chain is far from the top strategy in the format these days, and while it still has a place at many competitive pods, it's far from being worth the top spot on the list. And at number 5, we have Sisay Weatherlight Captain. This legendary human soldier costs 2 generic and 1 white mana and has 2 power and toughness. Sisay gains 1 power and toughness for each color amongst legendary permanents you control. By paying 1 mana of each color, you may search your library for a legendary permanent with a mana value less than Sisay's power and put it onto the battlefield. Although she takes some effort to get online, there are plenty of cards to help get to her ability quickly. From there, Sisay is a versatile toolbox able to search out all sorts of legendaries. In the early game, hate bearers like Lavinia, Azoria's Renegade, can impede faster combo decks from getting too far ahead. Sisay trades off on speed for her wealth of options that come from having instant speed access to almost any legendary creature in the game, assuming you get her to a high enough power level. This flexibility also shows up in her avenues to victory. While most competitive decks use Dockside Extortionist in one form or another if they can, Sisay is able to tutor up Emil the Blessed and potentially go infinite if Dockside makes enough treasures. She also makes better use of Planeswalkers than most competitive decks, with her main combo centering on using Oath of Teferi to give all of your Planeswalkers an extra loyalty ability activation each turn. From there, it's a matter of assembling Nico Bolas, Dragon God, who gains the abilities of all other Planeswalkers on the field, and Amintau, the Fate Shifter. Nico Bolas has an ability to draw you a card and force an opponent to exile a card from their hand or field. Amintau has an ability to exile another permanent you control, then return it to the field. These 3 cards, all of which can be searched up by Sisay, will eventually leave the opponent without any cards and allow you to draw through your whole deck. It is a 3-card combo, which makes it far from quick to kill, but Sisay's game plan is built with this in mind. It's an adaptive deck that uses her powerful abilities to ensure you're working towards whatever is best for the current situation, while threatening a few different potent combo kills. Legendary creatures are unsurprisingly popular even in casual commander, so Sisay's toolbox playstyle translates well there, allowing players to play any of their favorite splashy legends in the perfect shell to support them. Some even approach their Sisay decks as 5-color builds of a different legendary creature, and using Sisay as a way to bridge into the deck's actual focus. And at number 4, we have Kenrith the Returned King. This legendary noble costs 4 generic and 1 white mana, and has 5 power and toughness. Kenrith has 5 activated abilities, which each take a different color of mana. By paying 1 red mana, you can give all creatures trample and haste until the end of turn, meaning they can attack without summoning sickness and deal any excess damage over lethal in combat with a creature to the defending player. For 1 generic and 1 green mana, you can put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. 2 generic and 1 white mana allows target player to gain 5 life, and paying 3 generic and 1 blue lets target player draw a card. Finally, for 4 generic and 1 black mana, you may put target creature card from graveyard onto the battlefield under its owner's control. These 5 abilities are all simple, yet decently effective, if somewhat costly to use in excess. But, as has already been established with previous entries however, a lot of competitive games are won off the back of infinite combos, particularly combos that generate infinite mana. In that regard, Kenrith is arguably the best commander around, considering he's a game-winning infinite mana sink that gives you access to every color. The aforementioned Dockside Extortionist is often the most important card to find in most competitive games, since it facilitates some of the easiest infinite mana combos in the game. Kenrith's abilities are even worded in such a way that they can be leveraged as political tools, since you can target your opponents with these beneficial effects. Of course, that's more of a corner case scenario for what is overall abundantly straightforward commander. With infinite mana, Kenrith will gain you infinite life, draw your entire deck, give all your creatures haste, and make them infinitely big with trample, even if you have to revive them all from the graveyard. The commanders are powerful thanks to being an infinite mana sink, but there really is no comparison between those and just how perfect of a game-ending mana sink Kenrith is. It's both his greatest strength and also part of why he's not higher on this list. He's straightforward and simple, without much going on beyond being the best, most generically good option in a category commander that's at a premium in competitive pots. When it comes to the realm of casual, he certainly has a home, but there's no specific strategy that he helps define or support. Instead, Kenrith is a good commander for when you don't really have anything else to do in the command zone, or make active benefit of his abilities, like wanting a consistent source of haste for your creatures, or wanting a backup option for reanimator strategies. Regardless of if it's casual or competitive, Kenrith is defined by his wealth of options and lack of direct focus, leading to a powerful, if generic, commander. And at number 3, we have Cody Vociferous Codex. This legendary artifact construct costs 3 generic mana and has 1 power and 4 toughness. Cody makes it so that you cannot cast permanent spells at all while it's on the field. In return, he has an ability to pay 4 generic mana and tap Cody to add 1 mana of each color. When you cast your next spell this turn, exile cards from the top of your library until you exile an instant or sorcery with lesser mana value. Until end of turn, you may cast that card without paying its mana cost. Each other card exiled this way is put onto the bottom of your library in a random order. While Cody's ability is both positive in mana and provides a pseudo-cascade effect, his downside is so severe that the ability really needs to be game-winning. Fortunately, thanks to the help of Profane Tutor, a single Cody activation can often do exactly that. Profane Tutor is novel in that it has no conventional mana cost, and is instead intended to be played via the Suspend mechanic. This means Profane Tutor's mana value is 0, and thus something Cody can exploit. If you can activate Cody's ability, then cast any 1 mana value spell, you will exile cards until you hit an instant or sorcery with a lower mana value. Profane Tutor will then be the only card in your deck Cody's ability can actually hit. This essentially turns Cody into a tutor in the command zone. If you're going for the win, this tutor will usually search up Ad Nauseam, and you'll have 4 mana left over from Cody's Suspend on Ad Nauseam, meaning that the whole line is relatively inexpensive on your mana. This gives Cody a certain explosiveness throughout even the earliest stages of the game, since an opening hand with some mana rocks and Dark Ritual can often win on the spot. Cody is more of an all-in than most Ad Nauseam decks, especially given his rather steep downside. But in return for being so linear and all-in, you get some of the fastest wins in Commander. Of course, Cody's aggressive playstyle does draw a lot of attention, meaning Cody players will likely have to contend with the pod ready to check their nonsense. And when it comes to casual play, Cody often winds up playing as a silly gimmick deck, leaning more on novelty than actual strength of gameplay. If any format is a home for novelty, it is Commander, which is part of why he remains popular even if he's not the best, especially at a more casual level. And despite his shortcomings, Cody's niche as a hyper-aggressive competitive commander easily earns it a spot on this list. And at number 2 on this list, we have Najeela the Blade Blossom. This legendary human warrior costs 2 generic and 1 red mana, and has 3 power and 2 toughness. Whenever any warrior attacks, you may have its controller create a 1 power and toughness white warrior creature token that's tapped and attacking. During combat, you may pay 1 mana of every color to untap all attacking creatures. They gain trample, lifelink, and haste until end of turn. After that phase, there is an additional combat phase. At first blush, Najeela might seem closer to the Kindred commanders earlier on this list than the higher end competitive threats towards the top. Her warrior synergy is nice and leads to some incidental inclusions and builds, but her true strength comes in her activated ability. It is both repeatable and not limited to just warriors. This means as long as you have a means of producing the mana, you can take as many combat phases as you'd like. Druid's Repository gets a charge counter whenever a creature you control attacks, and you can remove a counter to add 1 mana of any color. Thus, as long as you have 5 or more creatures to attack with that will survive combat, you'll get enough counters to instantly pay for Najeela's ability and take another combat. This can repeat until your opponents are all dead, and this is just one of the cards that Najeela can pull off the combo with. It can be as simple as attacking with Vigilant Fatebearer Elder and tapping it for mana after doing so to pay for Najeela. This makes for a versatile and quick deck that can put up combat pressure that is always a card or 2 away from spiraling to lethal. Unlike Kenrith, which is an outlet waiting for good stuff strategy to helm, Najeela encourages a more focused and quick-paced game aiming to win as fast as possible. One of the deck's greatest strengths in competitive spheres is the level of backup plans it has. Beyond its main combo, it also runs demonic consultation lines and can even rely on classic aggro beats in a simplified game state. Najeela is a combo deck that can play the aggro game, and as such, it has explosive potential at basically every turn of the game, and it needs to be respected. Even more casual Najeela builds have massive potential to take over a game off the back of impressive turns with 2 to 3 combats. Even when not using her as a combo outlet to win, the sheer damage she helps push through can put her on par with many other aggressive casual decks. All of this makes her undoubtedly one of the best commanders ever printed. However, there's one 5-color commander who is certainly more egregious, even if he doesn't have quite the same competitive chops. And finally, at number 1, we have Golos Tireless Pilgrim. This legendary artifact scout costs 5 generic mana and has 3 power and 5 toughness. When Golos enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a land card and put it onto the battlefield tapped. By paying 2 generic and 1 mana of every color, you may exile the top 3 cards of your library and play them without paying their mana cost for the rest of this turn. Golos is the definition of a generic commander. Basically, any sort of strategy at any sort of power level could use Golos, given he has access to every color, and an effect that basically any deck could appreciate. Even for aggressive decks where ramping is less important, Golos can search any land, meaning any utility land imaginable is up for grabs. In the realm of competitive commander, this often came in the form of searching Boseiju, who shelters all, to make all your game-winning instants and sorceries uncounterable. However, Golos reached true notoriety not for his place in the competitive meta, but rather for how ubiquitous he was in casual. Golos' abilities muscled out a lot of other commanders who just did not measure up to the long-term generic value Golos offered. From a casual sense, basically any strategy that wanted to play 5 colors could run Golos, and many people opted for exactly that. Shortly after his printing, Golos was one of the most built commanders on popular commander decklist sites. Even if you initially wanted to play a 3-color commander deck, Golos allowed you to splash powerful spells from other colors and provided the mana fixing you'd want via his own ability. 5-color decks already benefit from a wide card pool, and Golos and his generic casting costs made it laughably easy for almost any strategy to play fast and loose with the color identity rules that were core to Commander. As such, for all of these reasons and more, Golos was banned entirely from Commander, and is to this day the only 5-color commander on the ban list. Despite not being as overwhelmingly strong as the likes of Najeela, in return, the sheer ease of use and ubiquity of Golos made it a nightmare for lower power level tables until it needed to be dealt with. With the rise of Commander as Magic's most played format, several sets have been released that actively cater to the casual players of this format. However, while not legal in Standard or Modern, these cards are legal in Eternal formats like Legacy and Vintage. Sometimes a card that's fair in a 4-person game is much more powerful in a head-to-head match, or a card is just so powerful that it sees play in any format it's legal in, and the fact that it was first printed in a Commander set is just pure coincidence. Today, we'll be looking at the best casual set cards that broke into competitive Magic. And at number 10, we have Containment Priest. This card costs 1 generic and 1 white mana for a 2 power and toughness human cleric. The ability Flash allows the player to cast the spell at any time they want, like an instant, meaning it can be played in response to something on your opponent's turn. This is relevant because its other effect says that if a non-token creature would enter the battlefield without being cast, exile it instead. While this effect does nothing to stop creature spells, it does prevent creatures from being cheated into play by basically every means. There are several decks in Legacy that aim to bring out creatures without casting them. Many creature-focused decks use the card Aether Vial to swarm the board and surprise your opponent with more creatures on their turn. Containment Priest completely stops Aether Vial and leaves your opponent forced to cast their spells fairly. The real strength of Containment Priest comes from its surprise factor thanks to having Flash. Reanimator decks in the format go all in trying to bring back a powerful creature from the grave with a spell like Reanimate. While most cards that sought reanimation are on-board answers, Containment Priest can be played as your opponent tries to reanimate their threat. Before the reanimation spell resolves, Containment Priest can enter the battlefield and exile the threat that they were trying to bring back. This way, Containment Priest isn't just a deterrent, but an active answer and counter that can remove someone's win condition from the game altogether. But beyond that, there's a level of versatility that comes with Containment Priest. A card like Rest in Peace will always be very effective against a graveyard-focused deck, but will be far less good in a creature-focused deck that uses Aether Vial. Containment Priest offers a way to check multiple strategies at once and be less narrow than other tech options. That does little to change the fact that there's one major downside to Containment Priest, is that not every deck is weak against it, even if it is less narrow than similar cards. In mirror matches, it's often the worst card in the deck, and thus usually relegated to the sideboards of controlling slower decks in the format. While it may depend on the right meta to be properly powerful, Containment Priest is still an aggressive answer to unfair decks in Legacy format, and thus still earns a 10th spot on this list. And at number 9, we have Sanctum Prelate. This human cleric costs 1 generic and 2 white mana, and has 2 power and toughness. When it enters the battlefield, you choose a number, and then neither player is able to cast non-creature spells with the mana value of that same number. So if someone chose a number 1 with Sanctum Prelate, neither player would be allowed to cast Brainstorm. In the original set this card is from, Conspiracy Take the Crown, the idea was for it to be part of a 4-person free-for-all environment, where 3 other players would be incentivized to remove the card for how powerful it is. In tournament play, where it's only one player against another, it's far easier to protect Sanctum Prelate with something like Mother of Runes and prevent it from being removed. And unlike casual formats where mana values tend to be more varied with less streamlined mana curves, in Legacy, most decks play the most efficient spells possible. And as such, a great deal of the most effective non-creature spells in the format have a mana value of 1. And against other decks, like with Storm that often wins with Tendrils of Agony as a primary win condition, there can be often a specific number for Sanctum Prelate to name that can prevent your opponent from winning the game until Sanctum Prelate has been removed. What makes Sanctum Prelate most effective is that the deck that runs it, an aggressive white deck called Death and Taxes, runs almost entirely creature spells in the main board, meaning that no matter the number Sanctum Prelate picks, it will usually have little to no effect on the Death and Taxes player's game plan. The card is even searchable with Recruiter of the Guard thanks to only having 2 toughness, meaning that the card meshes in well with the already existing wants of Death and Taxes. From the moment the card was printed, it was extremely effective in the Legacy and Vintage formats to those decks reliant on the powerful non-creature spells available, and still is to this day. Since then, it's even been reprinted in the modern format to assist white creature-focused decks in the format. Coming in at number 8, we have Flusterstorm. This card is an instant that costs a single blue mana. It counters an instant or sorcery spell unless its controller pays 1 generic mana. If this were all the card did, it would be a strictly worse 4-spike and be completely unplayable in any sense. As the card's name hints, however, Flusterstorm has the Storm keyword. This keyword copies a spell a number of times equal to the number of spells cast this turn. This counts spells from both players, meaning if Flusterstorm is countering the first spell your opponent has cast, this will make it at minimum 2 copies of Flusterstorm. Now, instead of being a worse 4-spike, Flusterstorm is closer to a mana leak, which is more playable but far less potent. The design of Flusterstorm clearly takes the 4-player format of Commander into mind, with the storm count rising for each player, and in most sanctioned formats, stacks that high would be a rarity. But in Legacy, and especially Vintage, the prominence of Storm decks makes Flusterstorm an actually potent card. Storm decks are built around the Storm mechanic, casting rituals and churning through the deck, casting as many spells as they can in one turn, and end the game with one big Storm spell. Usually it's quite difficult to counter a Storm deck's win condition since Storm splits the spell up into separate copies. Even if you can counter one spell, the other copies all go through. This makes Flusterstorm the perfect anti-Storm card in that each copy of Flusterstorm can target each copy of Great Shot or Tendrils of Agony on the stack and prevent every copy from resolving. This makes the card a fantastic option for Storm decks to run in the main board as a cheap option to break the mirror, as well as stopping any other interactions that may interfere with them. Being both strong in and against Storm decks has made Flusterstorm arguably the most widely seen Storm card in Vintage, given just how prominent the deck is in the format. And it shows up frequently in Legacy main and sideboards as well. And at number 7, we have Kappa Cannoneer. This creature costs 5 generic and 1 blue mana for a turtle warrior with 4 power and toughness. Its most relevant ability up front is Improvise, which allows you to supplement paying its mana cost by tapping artifacts. Each artifact you tap pays for 1 generic mana of capping Cannoneer's cost, potentially letting you cast this for just 1 blue mana if you tap enough artifacts. This ability allows Kappa Cannoneer to come down extremely quickly in Legacy, especially with the prevalence of 0-mana artifacts like Mistress Bauble in the format. Artifact decks in Legacy have as many cheap artifacts as they can to turn into Mox Opal, which needs 3 artifacts on the battlefield to tap for mana. Since these decks were already built to have Mox Opal working on turn 1, these decks can fairly consistently play Kappa Cannoneer on turn 2 or 3. Playing it out so early means that often decks are unable to even interact with it, given that it also has an ability called Ward, which makes it so someone must pay an additional cost when targeting the creature. In this case, Kappa Cannoneer has Ward 4, meaning any spell that an opponent casts targeting it would cost 4 extra mana. In the early stages of the game, most decks cannot afford that cost, and thus Kappa is virtually untargetable for multiple turns. Its final ability provides a protection from dying in combat, as well as whenever an artifact enters a battlefield under your control, you put a +1/+1 counter on Kappa and it cannot be blocked this turn. In a 20 life format like Legacy, even just a few turns of uninterrupted Kappa Cannoneer attacks can shred through over half an opponent's life. Since its printing in the Kamigawa Neo Dynasty Commander decks, Kappa Cannoneer has been a mainstay in aggressive artifact decks in Legacy. And at number 6, we have Retrofitter Foundry. This is a 1-mana artifact with multiple abilities. You can pay 2 generic mana and tap it to create a 1 power, 1 toughness servo token. You can pay 1 mana, sacrifice a servo, tap it, and create a 1 power, 1 toughness Thopter token with flying. Or you can tap it and sacrifice a Thopter to create a 4 power and toughness construct token. On top of this, you can also pay 3 generic mana to untap Retrofitter Foundry. This card is designed for you to chain your way up from small tokens to one that has an ability that makes it only blockable by other creatures with flying or reach, and then finally a creature with more formidable stats. The card had already seen play in some artifact decks as well as ninja decks that wanted the Flying Thopter to attack without getting blocked, but the card saw even more play after the set Modern Horizons 2. This set introduced Urza's Saga, a land that doubled as a Saga enchantment. After enough turns passed, Urza's Saga would reach its third ability, which searches your library for an artifact that costs 1 mana. This ability allows someone to search up Retrofitter Foundry, leading to even more decks including a single copy of the deck just off the chance it was relevant in the matchup. Retrofitter Foundry being able to produce servo tokens repeatedly combos with Urza's Saga's construct tokens. The land can be tapped to produce creature tokens whose power and toughness are equal to the number of artifacts you control. So not only does Retrofitter Foundry count as 1, every servo it makes adds onto the total and grows your constructs and makes them into even more lethal threats. What puts it ahead of a card like Kappa Cannoneer earlier on this list is that this card is viable in a wider range of decks. Slower, attrition-based decks also want the value that comes with Retrofitter Foundry, regardless of any pre-existing artifact synergies. This wider range of viable decks we played in earns its a spot here at number 6 on this list. And at number 5, we have Scavenging Ooze. This ooze costs 1 generic and 1 green mana and has 2 power and toughness. For 1 green mana, you can exile a card from a graveyard. If that card was a creature, you can also put a +1/+1 counter on Scavenging Ooze and gain 1 life. Scavenging Ooze comes from the first set of Commander pre-constructed decks printed back in 2011. At the time, there generally were not many creatures on this level when it came to interacting with the graveyard. As such, the card was an instant staple in Legacy where it could remove relevant cards from the graveyard. It saw most success in creature-oriented mid-range decks that wanted to prevent unfair decks from going over its head and eventually pushing for the win. Scavenging Ooze was able to prevent graveyard-centered decks from winning early and grew with each creature it exiled, quickly snowballing into an actual offensive threat. Eventually, Scavenging Ooze would be reprinted into standard legal set and find its way into the modern Pioneer card pool. It saw and sees consistent play there as well, oftentimes only being cut for other graveyard hate options in the format. However, despite over a decade of further anti-graveyard cards being printed, Scavenging Ooze still sees play in multiple formats to this day. Most other answers to problematic cards in the grave, like Graph Digger's Cage, are irrelevant in matchups where your opponent isn't entirely focused on the graveyard. However, Scavenging Ooze is still strong in a more fair matchup, exiling creatures from either graveyard where its controller has extra mana to regain life and try and control the board with an even larger ooze. And in the matchups where Scavenging Ooze is against a graveyard-focused deck, the card is a must-kill or else it's very unlikely the graveyard deck will be able to function at all, let alone win. Even decks like Storm need to get large number of cards in the graveyard for Underworld Breach, and removing the abundance of spells can outright deny the Storm player a chance to win. And in the Pioneer format, Scavenging Ooze will remove all the fodder in the graveyard, so blue decks are less likely to cast their powerful delve spells. A card like Dig Through Time can be game-ending with how much card selection it gives its caster, but that mana cost is so high, its cost needs to be offset by excellent cards in the graveyard to pay the delve cost. And if Scavenging Ooze has already removed those cards, it could delay or outright stop someone from being able to cast that powerful delve spell at all. Its flexibility has allowed it to stay relevant in multiple formats at once for over a decade, but the cards ahead of it on this list have had much more pronounced impacts, and have less similar cards have been printed since to compare them to and potentially compete for slots and decks in these competitive formats. And at number 4, we have Toxic Deluge. This sorcery costs 2 generic and 1 black mana. It lets the caster pay any amount of life, and then all creatures lose that much power and toughness until the end of the turn. If a creature's toughness would hit 0 this way, or go into the negative numbers, it kills the creature. This is non-damaging and also not destroyed either, meaning this gets around cards that are indestructible and can still remove them. This makes Toxic Deluge a board wipe that can kill just about anything in the format, provided someone pays enough life to do so. But what also makes Toxic so effective is that it only costs 3 mana. Generally speaking, most board wipes at the cheapest are 4 mana, with Black's best board wipe before this card being Damnation. Toxic Deluge costs a mana less than what is generally considered a rate 4 board wipe's mana value, and its only downside is that it has a hefty life cost. And even then, some decks use this life cost to their advantage, seeing as how Death Shadow decks in the format tend to want their life total as low as possible anyways, and actively run cards like Toxic Deluge because of how easily they can facilitate that. Even in slower control decks in the format, Toxic Deluge provides a great deal of value. Even if it costs a great deal of life, an unanswered board of strong creatures will wind up taking even more life from you in the long run. Toxic Deluge lets you use that life as a resource and get rid of the creatures pressuring you, and in a turn, build up your own board. Board wipes are used when you're often on the back foot anyways, and if it can put you into a stabilized position, then the life cost is more than worth it. Which is why Toxic Deluge has been the premier board wipe in Black and Legacy ever since its printing in the 2013 Commander decks. Coming in at number 3, we have Minsk and Boo Timeless Heroes. This card costs 4 mana, 2 generic, then 1 green and 1 red. This Planeswalker comes from the Commander Legends Battle for Baldur's Gate, and was initially designed to be used as a commander in the format. Planeswalkers are usually not legal commanders, but this card specifically has an ability that allows it to be used as a commander. Despite this being a rather big bend in rules text, it's hardly relevant as Minsc and Boo have seen a majority of play in the Legacy format. When it enters the battlefield, or during your upkeep every turn after, you may choose to create a legendary hamster token named Boo. It has 1 power and toughness as well as trample, which means any excess damage it deals to a creature is dealt to the player, as well as haste, which ignores summoning sickness. Providing a creature on entry is already quite good for a planeswalker, but it can also boost it via Minsc +1 ability, which puts 3 +1/+1 counters on a creature with trample and or haste. This makes it so that Boo tokens can get even stronger, allowing it to trample through for more damage. Or you can activate the -2 loyalty ability, which sacrifices a creature and deals damage to any target equal to that creature's power, and if that creature was a hamster, you also draw that many cards. Minsc can throw Boo at problematic creatures as removal or deal direct damage, drawing you back cards and always replacing the token in the upkeep. Minsc and Boo sees play primarily in 4-color control decks, which are often preyed upon by aggressive mono-white decks. Minsc and Boo can provide repeated removal for threats, or more importantly, provide pressure to protection effects like Mother of Runes. Mother of Runes would usually help stem the tide of removal, but now with the assistance of the -2 ability, these control decks are able to more effectively force the protection of Mother of Runes and freeing up other interactions to be used more effectively. Beyond this, in a controlling game state, the control player can instead choose to grow their Boo token and attack in for damage, effectively serving as a win condition for the deck as well. There's essentially no stage of the game where drawing a copy of Minsc and Boo is bad, seeing as how it represents removal, furthering the board state, and a card draw all in one. And at number 2, we have Seasoned Dungeoneer. This card costs 3 generic and 1 white mana for a 3 power 4 toughness human warrior. When it enters the battlefield, you take the initiative. The initiative is a mechanic designed for Commander in which one player has the initiative and another player may take it by dealing combat damage to the player who currently has it. Whenever a player takes the initiative, or at the beginning of their upkeep when they have the initiative, they venture into the Undercity. This is a play on the dungeon mechanics from the Adventures in the Forgotten Realm set, with the Undercity function as a token with various optional effects that get stronger the further down you venture. The idea of the initiative is it's supposed to pass back and forth around a free-for-all table and incentivize the whole group to attack each other. However, in a format like Legacy or Vintage, there's only one opponent. And that means there's only one person who can threaten to take the initiative. It's much easier to keep the initiative for several turns on end, getting further through the dungeon and gaining even more potent effects. For example, one early option in the Undercity causes target player to lose 5 life. In Commander, all players start with 40 life, but in sanctioned formats, the starting life total is 20, and thus visiting this one room in the Undercity deals 1/4 of your opponent's life in one go. As if this wasn't strong enough, Seasoned Dungeoneer's other ability makes it so whenever you attack with a creature of the appropriate type, be it cleric, rogue, warrior, or wizard, that creature gains protection from creatures until the end of the turn, meaning no creatures are even allowed to block it. This means even if your opponent takes back the initiative, all one has to do is attack with a creature of the right type and it will take initiative right back. On top of this, the creature with the protection also explores, which allows its control to look at the top card of the library. If it's a land, it goes into the player's hand. And if it's a non-land, the creature gets a +1/+1 counter and the player may either choose to put that card back on top of the deck or into the graveyard. Explore provides the mono-white decks that run this card the card selections the color often lacks. These decks use Ancient Tomb and other sources of fast mana to get Seasoned Dungeoneer onto the board as fast as possible. You enter the Undercity when it enters and search your library for land thanks to the Secret Entrance Room ability. Then the next turn you can attack with it and choose to forego path to get 2 +1/+1 counters. Then the turn after that you can choose the Trap Room and make your opponent lose 5 life. Although this sounds like a very simple play pattern, this is a total of 14 unblockable damage over the course of just 3 turns. And could be more assuming the explorability works in your favor. Seasoned Dungeoneer looks simple on the surface, but once taken into account with the Undercity and how it's not balanced for 1v1 play, it becomes an obviously powerful card. It's so powerful in fact, people are using Black Lotus and Vintage to cast it on turn 1 because it can take control of the game all by itself. And finally at number 1, we have True Name Nemesis. This Merfolk Rogue costs 1 generic and 2 blue mana to cast, and has 3 power and 1 toughness. When it enters the battlefield, you get to choose a player, and then this card has protection from that player. Protection means that whatever source the permanent has protection from is unable to damage, enchant, block, or even target that permanent. In Commander, this leaves 2 other opponents who are able to freely interact with it, but one who is completely unable to touch it. This means in a 1v1 format like Legacy, where there's only one opponent, True Name Nemesis becomes an extremely difficult card to remove. There are counters, such as using the aforementioned Toxic Deluge, but no source the opponent controls can target or damage True Name Nemesis, making it essentially unblockable and unkillable barring those few workaround solutions. This makes True Name Nemesis a perfect wielder for one of Legacy's defining equipment, such as Umezawa's Jite, a card that needs the creature it's attached onto to deal direct damage to be able to use its effects. True Name Nemesis is able to get counters from Umezawa's Jite freely, or just simply press for an unblockable 3 damage for every turn if left unblocked. The creature is especially potent in dedicated Merfolk decks, with Lord of Atlantis effects making it even bigger and pushing for even more damage. But for years, even without Merfolk synergies, True Name Nemesis was one of the strongest creatures in the format, only recently falling off to some degree in lieu of powerful cards from recent years. But even still, it sees playing decks looking to leverage equipment like Stoneforge Mystic-centric Stoneblade decks. Despite not being the height of competitive play in Legacy anymore, True Name Nemesis' long history as one of the format's premier threats earns it the top spot on this list. Commander is a very different format from the rest of Magic. Being a multiplayer format with a higher starting life total and a higher deck size means that tons of effects just aren't anywhere near as useful as they are in other formats. This means that lots of cards that are staples in Magic are pretty bad in Commander. So today, we're going to go over the staples that translate into the format the worst. Starting us off at number 10, we have Jace, the Mind Sculptor. This is a planeswalker with a mana cost of 2 and 2 blue and has a starting loyalty of 3. You can +2 it in order to look at the top card of a player's library, and then put it on the top or bottom of that player's library. You can 0 him to draw 3 cards, then put 2 cards from your hand on the top of your deck. You can -1 him to bounce a target creature, and you can -12 him to exile all cards from the target player's library, then have them shuffle their hand into the library. For anyone who's a little bit confused about planeswalkers, let's go over them real quick, because it's actually important for explaining why Jace is on this list. A planeswalker loyalty is like their life total. Their plus abilities give them loyalty, and their minus abilities cost them loyalty. They can be attacked like players. Also, you can activate one of the loyalty abilities once per turn, so if you have 0 Jace, you can't +2 him or -1 him that turn, or 0 him again. So, planeswalkers like Jace can get you a lot of value if they stick on the battlefield, but are weak to things like creatures who can simply attack them to death. Jace is a really strong planeswalker, able to get you tons of card advantage if he sticks around. The key phrase being, if he sticks around. As any Commander player will tell you, planeswalkers are significantly worse in that format. Having multiple opponents that can attack your planeswalkers makes them very fragile. Most of the time, your planeswalker will activate one ability, and then you'll have to pass turn, only for them to get attacked to death by 3 of your opponent's consecutive turns. Jace is here representing the vast majority of planeswalkers, as they all suffer from the same problem, and Jace is pretty famous for being a strong walker. There are a few planeswalkers that have escaped this issue, however. Dak Faden has a -2 to steal an artifact on a 3-mana planeswalker. This is just a great rate for the effect of stealing an artifact, so people play him and immediately steal something, and not really care if he dies afterwards. Ugin the Spear Dragon and Elspeth's Sun Champion both have minuses that can wipe the board, making it unlikely for them to die in the following turn cycles, as there just aren't too many creatures to attack them anyway. Still, the vast majority of planeswalkers don't see play in the format for this exact reason, so Jace finds his way onto this list. And at number 9, we have Engineered Explosives. This is an artifact with a mana cost of X, meaning any amount of mana. It has Sunburst, meaning it enters the battlefield with a number of charge counters equal to the number of colors of mana spent to cast it, and you can pay 2 and sacrifice explosives to destroy each non-land permanent with a mana value equal to the number of charge counters on explosives. Explosives is a staple sideboard card in multiple formats. Its ability to wipe the board of every card with a mana value of your choice is extremely strong, as you can easily get a ton of card advantage in tempo by getting rid of a huge investment from your opponent without touching any of your own cards. Explosives is mostly used to punish decks that plan on spamming the board with tons of cheap cards. Decks like Hammer Time use tons of 1-mana cards to accomplish their game plan, so a single explosives can have a huge impact on the game. However, explosives lose a lot of value in Commander. Commander is a format focused on a lot more expensive cards, with way more 4, 5, 6, and 7 mana value cards getting thrown around. Sure, explosives will be able to take out a few cards on most boards, but it's very hard to get that kind of swingy board clear and activations that most people play the card for. Additionally, if you want to detonate the explosives of 4 or 5 to get rid of high value targets, you're starting to spend a lot of mana. Not to mention, you might not be able to make that many colors of mana in the first place. This means that in a lot of situations, a more standard board wipe will do you better. The main attraction of a card like Explosives is being able to make it asymmetrical, how cheap it can be, and being able to activate it at instant speed. The only real big advantage it maintains in Commander is that it's instant speed. Now, this card is bad at most tables, but it does get better the higher power level you're playing at. People play Commander at a lot of different power levels, but the higher they go, the more they centralize around cheaper and cheaper cards. This means that Explosives get better and better the stronger the meta you're in. However, it's very inconsistent, as it's hard to know going into a blind meta what kind of cards people are playing. Due to how high the variance is, most players won't risk playing the card, though it does still have a place in very specific metas, which is why it's only at number 9. And at number 8, we have Hall of Storm Giants. This is a land that you can tap for 1 blue mana. It has the abilities where it enters the battlefield tapped if you control 2 or more other lands. You can also pay 5 and 1 blue to turn it into a 7/7 blue giant creature with Ward 3 until the end of the turn, but it's still a land. Ward, for anyone who doesn't know, is an ability where whenever that permanent becomes a target of a spell or ability an opponent controls, you counter it unless your opponent pays the cost, which in this case is 3 mana. Hull is one of the more recent cards in a long line of creature lands, which are lands that can turn into a creature for a turn for a small amount of mana. These cards have always been heavily played in a variety of formats, for the ability to pressure your opponent's life total if both players are running low on gas. If both players have used up a bunch of their cards and don't really have any to play, you can animate your creature land and swing in for damage turn after turn, slowly chipping away at their life total. This extra damage could be the difference between winning and losing a game. The inevitability these cards provide is great for such a low cost. However, this doesn't really work out in Commander. The higher life total means that extra damage does a lot less, and having multiple opponents means that someone's going to find something much better than your creature land to play eventually. In most formats, the downside of coming in tapped later in the game isn't enough to outweigh the upside of having such a great late game threat. But in Commander, you're basically playing a land that comes in tapped for no reason. There are much better utility lands you could be playing anyway, as cards like Desolate Lighthouse and the like work better as mana sinks to find you more action, rather than spending that mana to do an inconsequential amount of damage. And at number 7, we have Kolaghan's Command. This is an instant with a mana cost of 1, 1 black, and 1 red, with the effect where you get to choose 2 of the following. You return target creature from your graveyard to your hand, or target player discards a card, or you destroy target artifact, or Kolaghan's Command deals 2 damage to any target. Kolaghan's Command is a 2-for-1 machine in most formats. Its ability to pick apart board states in formats like Modern is something that has to be seen to believe. The 2 damage can take out way more creatures than you'd think, and the other 3 abilities together ensure that Command will always be able to trade with something. At the worst, Kolaghan's Command can get a card out of your opponent's hand and a creature out of your graveyard. However, you do really want to get things off the board, as not only do you get card advantage, but you get a boost in tempo as well. This tempo is a big part of why Kolaghan's Command doesn't translate all that well to Commander. You'll probably be able to get a creature out of your graveyard and destroy an artifact, but you usually want to kill a creature with its 2 damage mode when you cast Command. This is far less likely in Commander, as creatures are on average much bigger and aren't likely to die to 2 damage. Additionally, you can only get a card out of 1 of your 3 opponents' hands, which doesn't get you as much card advantage, as your other 2 opponents won't lose anything. So Kolaghan's Command is worse at getting you card advantage and a worse tempo play in the format, meaning it has virtually no edge whatsoever. You're better off playing a simple draw spell that will give you access to better cards if you really want a 2-for-1. And at number 6, we have Aether Vial. This is an artifact with a mana cost of 1, and it has the abilities where, at the beginning of your upkeep, you can put a charge counter on Aether Vial, and you can tap the vial to put a creature card with mana value equal to the number of charge counters on the vial from your hand into the battlefield. Aether Vial is a staple in creature-based decks in both Modern and Legacy. Usually, rather than try to use the vial to cheat giant creatures out, players will just park it on 2 counters and use it to cheat out creatures every turn. This is basically a free 2 mana every single turn, which is a huge boost to your tempo. Additionally, because you aren't casting any of the cards you play this way, they also can't be counterspelled. This is a big boost for creature-based decks, but no one plays the card in Commander. The main reason for this is that Commander is a singleton format with 99 card decks. Vial is a card that's very good early on in the game, but it loses value the longer a game goes on. The card doesn't do anything to turn you play it, as it doesn't have any counters on it yet. Then on the next turn, it will only do something if you have a 1 mana creature in hand, and then the turn after that, it might do something if you have a 2 mana creature in hand. The fact is, not only will you basically never have Aether Vial in hand on turn 1, but decks, even creature-based decks, don't run enough creatures with low enough mana values to consistently put something onto the battlefield. You can use any of the various tutors to find Vial early, but that just isn't really worth it. There are lots of better cards to find, like Soul Ring, which gives you just as much of a mana advantage as Vial does, and faster to boot. The fact is, without being able to rely on opening Vial in your opening hand a good amount of the time, and without being able to know you have a bunch of creatures to play off of it, its ability isn't strong enough to justify playing the card. And at number 5, we have Eidolon of the Great Revel. This is a 2/2 enchantment creature spirit with a mana cost of 2 red. It has the ability where, whenever any player casts a spell with a mana value 3 or less, Eidolon deals 2 damage to that player. Eidolon is a staple in aggro decks in multiple formats. The card sees heavy play in Pioneer, Modern, and Legacy. The reason for this is really simple. In those formats, most spells cost 3 or less mana. This means that Eidolon will be triggering on most spells players cast, including your own. Luckily, aggro decks are really good at pumping out damage, and Eidolon is better for whatever player has the higher life total. Most aggro decks are fine with taking 2 damage to resolve a burn spell that does 3 or 4 damage. In a lot of situations, Eidolon feels less like an aggro card and more like a stack piece, making it so that your opponent has to really take the phrase, "your life total is a resource" to heart. They really have to think about how worth it taking the damage is on each of their spells. This card translates poorly to Commander for 2 reasons. First, the higher average mana value of spells, and second, the much higher life total. Not only are you only triggering the effect off of around a half of the cards being played, you're also doing an insignificant amount of damage. Not to mention there are just cards with very similar effects that are way better suited to the format. Rurik Thar the Unbound is a 6/6 for 6 mana that has the ability where whenever any player casts a non-creature spell, it deals 6 damage to that player. While it does require a much higher mana investment, the increase in damage makes it far more intimidating to try and play into. Ultimately, Eidolon's ability just doesn't deal enough damage in a format with a starting life total of 40. And at number 4, we have Surgical Extraction. This is an instant with a mana cost of 1 Phyrexian black mana, meaning you can pay it with 1 black mana or 2 life, and it has the effect where you exile a target card from a graveyard that isn't a basic land card, then you search its owner's library, hand, and graveyard for any number of cards with the same name and exile all of them, then they shuffle. This card is probably the most heavily played card with this kind of effect. Black gets the ability to search their opponent's library and exile all of them pretty frequently, but getting the effect for 0 mana makes it much better. This card is great against both graveyard-focused decks that are going to put important cards in the graveyard and combo decks, if you can manage to put one of their combo pieces into the graveyard. Not every deck is going to be affected by this all that much, as lots of decks have tons of replaceable cards. However, any deck that really needs a specific card to win can get really easily blown out by Surgical. However, in Commander, players will only have 1 copy of any card in their deck, unless they're playing cards that specifically say they can play more copies. As a result, the only real effect of the card is exiling a single card from a graveyard. There are tons of cards that do that for far better, as cards like Cling to Dust have a lot more to offer. This card loses basically all of its value in Commander, so it's no wonder why basically nobody runs it. And at number 3, we have Sinkhole. This is a sorcery with a mana cost of 2 black with the effect to destroy target land. This is one of the most undercosted land destruction effects in the game. The going rate for good land destruction is 3 mana, and playing a whole bunch of 3 mana stone rain effects was a real strategy for years in Magic. Wizards eventually decided this style of deck was unfun and started pricing land destruction at 4 mana, and the card stopped seeing play as a result. Playing a whole bunch of cheap land destruction can make it very hard for your opponent to cast anything, and if they start missing land drops, you can easily run them out of lands entirely. Sinkhole is a bit limited as to where it can see play, but it does see play in mono black pox decks and Legacy, though these decks aren't all that common. If the card were legal in formats like Modern or Pioneer, it would see all kinds of play. But Legacy is such a fast format that cards like Sinkhole are actually fine in that format. In Commander, land destruction spells in general barely see any play, outside of the occasional mass land destruction spell. The issue is that land destruction effects are only really valuable if you have a critical mass of them. The point is to leave your opponent with so few lands that they can't cast their spells. If you only take out 1 land, you're not really doing much. And since you have 3 opponents, you won't be able to blow up enough of their lands with single target land removal. Now, there are land destruction effects that do see play in Commander, but they're there to snipe particularly strong lands. Cards like Strip Mine and Assassin's Trophy are a lot more flexible than something like Sinkhole, so they see a lot more play. Without being able to actually restrict a player's mana, Sinkhole just isn't very good. And at number 2, we have Murktide Regent. This is a 3/3 dragon with a mana cost of 5 and 2 blue. It has Delve, which means you can exile cards from your graveyard to help cast it, each card you exile paying for 1. It enters the battlefield with +1/+1 counters on it for each instant and sorcery card you exiled when casting it, and whenever an instant or sorcery card leaves the graveyard, you put a 1/1 counter on it. Murktide Regent is a great, efficient beater that sees a ton of play in Modern and Legacy. This card is basically a 5/5 or 6/6 flyer for 2 blue in those formats, as getting a bunch of sorceries and instants in your graveyards to delve away is really easy. The thing is, this card doesn't really see play in Commander, and the main reason for that is that cheap, efficient beaters just aren't as valuable in that format. Having multiple opponents would make this card worse at ending a game on its own, but the higher life total means that this card is barely even a threat. Players can easily shrug off multiple attacks from a Murktide and simply play a bigger threat or remove the creature whenever they need to. Not to mention cards like Treasure Cruise and Dig Through Time are both legal in that format, which in such a combo-based format are much better uses of your mana and cards in your graveyard. This is a problem that tons of these big early threats suffer. Cards like Tarmogoyf, Gurmag Angler, and Delver of Secrets just don't put enough pressure on your opponent in a format like Commander, and you're better off spending your early turns playing ramp or draw spells. Considering these threats have defined formats in the past, seeing them see so little play in a format is kind of shocking, but it's not as big of a drop-off as the number 1 spot on this list. And at number 1, we have Thoughtseize. This is a sorcery with a mana cost of 1 black, and the effect where target opponent reveals their hand. You choose a non-land card from it, and they discard that card. Then you lose 2 life. This card is an absolute staple in black decks in every format where it's legal. This effect is amazing against almost every single deck. Taking the best card of your opponent's hand can completely stop them from executing their game plan. The downside of losing 2 life is basically nothing when compared to stopping your opponent from executing their game plan properly. On top of that, the information these discard spells give you is also very valuable, as letting you know exactly what your opponent has allows you to play around their cards perfectly. Just about every black deck plays some number of Thoughtseize or other similar discard spells. Despite all of this power, the card sees very little play in Commander, and this is entirely due to having more than one opponent. Thoughtseizing one of your 3 opponents leaves both of you down 1 card, whereas both of your opponents will still have all their resources. This principle is why most players consider spot removal worse overall in Commander. However, spot removal is simply too important not to play, as you need to be able to stop your opponents from trying to kill you at some point. Discard spells don't have the luxury of letting you wait until one of your opponents commits to a board to respond, as you have to preemptively use the card to remove any threats. As a result, only very specific commanders utilize these cards if they're able to get around their downsides. There are commanders like Zelvar, who allows you to copy spells that target opponents or opponents' permanents and get a different copy for each opponent, and Tiny Bones, who allows you to draw a card at the end of the turn if an opponent discarded a card this turn. Both of these commanders can get around the downsides of the card in a multiplayer format by either letting it hit each opponent or giving you a card back. However, just about every card has some commanders that make them playable. The huge shift from being a staple that just about every deck in its colors plays, to being a niche option that only some commanders want to, is easily the biggest downgrade on this list, which is why it easily takes the #1 spot. Infinite combos usually result in you winning the game. However, there are some infinites that, for one reason or another, don't quite work. This can be for a huge number of reasons, but it's usually because the setup required is just ludicrous or because the result of the combo isn't actually very helpful. Now, this is mostly a compilation of interesting and funny ways players have found to go infinite, as almost none of these are things you'd actively want to do in an average game of Magic. With all that said, let's see what some of the worst infinites players have managed to put together. Starting us off at number 10, we have Delina, Wild Mage, and Pixie Guide. Delina is a legendary 3/2 Elf Shaman with a mana cost of 3 and 1 red. It has the ability where, whenever it attacks, you choose target creature you control, then roll a d20. On a 1 to 14, you create a tapped attacking token that's a copy of that creature, except it's not legendary and it has exile this at the end of combat. On a 15 to 20, you create one of those tokens and then you may roll again. Pixie Guide is a 1/3 fairy with a mana cost of 1 blue. It has flying, meaning it can't be blocked by creatures except with flying or reach. It has the ability where, if you would roll 1 or more die, you may instead roll that many dice plus 1 and ignore the lowest roll. The combo here is pretty intuitive. Once you play enough copies of Pixie Guide, you're actually far more likely to hit the roll again mode on Delina than if you were to fail it. The math on this is obviously a bit complicated, but to give you an idea of how the odds are, we'll go over a few examples. With 1 guide, you have a 51% chance of getting a 15 or higher. With 2 guides, you have a 66% chance. And with 3, it's 76%, 4, 83%, and 5, it's 88%. With the way the ability works, each time you hit a 15 or greater, you'll have a copy of Pixie Guide and its ability will be online, meaning it will automatically be giving you another dice to roll in Delina's ability. You'll need a few copies of Guide starting out, but you don't have to get all that lucky to earn over a 90% chance of success with each interaction. And each time you win, the chances of failure get smaller and smaller. This can let you go infinite pretty easily, though this causes a bit of an issue, or at least it did before Delina received an errata to fix the problem. Before the errata, Delina didn't say you may roll again, it just said roll again, meaning it was a mandatory part of resolving the card's effect. This means that if you do go essentially infinite, you'd never be able to stop. This was made even worse by the fact that the loop was non-deterministic. This means you don't actually know what the outcome of the loop will be until you actually do it. Because this loop involves rolling dice, you obviously won't know what happens until you roll. This means that the loop can't be shortcutted at all. With most infinites, you can just explain to your opponent what's going to happen and skip through doing all the steps at that point in the game. With Delina, you have to go through the motions of rolling all the dice every time. This was a big problem, as it could lead to Delina essentially soft-locking games for an unknown amount of time. This would probably have been higher up on this list, but it has been fixed. Now the infinite is actually pretty powerful, even if it isn't exactly practical. And at number 9, we have Basalt Monolith and Mesmeric Orb. Basalt Monolith is an artifact that costs 3 mana. It has the abilities where it doesn't untap during your untap step. You can tap it for 3 mana, and you can pay 3 mana to untap it. Mesmeric Orb is an artifact with a mana cost of 2. It is the ability where, whenever a permanent becomes untapped, its controller mills a card. The combo is very simple, at least on the surface. With both cards on the battlefield, you can tap Monolith for 3 mana, and then use the mana to untap it. This leaves you in basically the exact same position. But now you have a trigger from Mesmeric Orb that mills you for 1 card. You can just repeat this over and over to mill as many cards as you want. This was the basis for a very interesting, powerful, and soft banned combo deck in Legacy called Four Horsemen. This combo starts with the titular Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, 4 copies of Narcomoeba, who at this point is basically synonymous with extremely silly graveyard-based combo decks. This is a 1/1 with flying that puts itself on the battlefield from the graveyard whenever it's milled. By milling your entire deck, you get all 4 Necromoebas out. Then you would use them to cast Dread Return, a card that lets you reanimate a creature and can be cast out of your graveyard by sacrificing 3 creatures. But it has to be exiled afterwards. In the old days, this would be used to grab Sharum the Hegemon. This is a 5/5 flyer that puts an artifact from your graveyard into the battlefield when it enters the battlefield. This would be used to grab Blasting Station, the penultimate piece of the combo. This is a 3-mana artifact that lets you tap it and sacrifice a creature to deal 1 damage to any target. And whenever a creature enters the battlefield, you untap Blasting Station. This would be used to sacrifice Necromoebas for damage, though you obviously wouldn't have enough of these in your deck to kill your opponent. This is why the deck uses Emrakul the Aeon's Torn, which would shuffle your graveyard into your library when it was put into your graveyard. This is where the problems come in. The way the deck works is that after it got Blasting Station into the battlefield, it would mill itself until it milled an Emrakul. This would shuffle your Necromoebas back into your library where you can mill them again, sacrifice them to Blasting Station, and whittle down your opponent. The reason this didn't quite work is that Emrakul's in your deck, which meant if you had Emrakul before any parts in your combo, you'd have to try mill it again. This makes the combo non-deterministic, just like the Delinia combo, which means you couldn't shortcut it. In this case, this means it ran up against slow play rules. Trying multiple times to pull off your combo and hitting Emrakul first meant you weren't meaningfully changing the game state. And if you did that a few times in a row, your opponent could just call a judge on you and possibly have you disqualified. This meant that despite the fact that this combo was actually quite good, it was effectively soft banned due to how it would slow down tournaments. This leaves the combo in a weird spot, where it can technically work, but it can't actually be used. And at number 8, we have Ichormoon Gauntlet and a bunch of Planeswalkers. Ichormoon Gauntlet is an artifact that costs 2 and 1 blue. It has the abilities where it gives all of your Planeswalkers a 0-cost loyalty ability to proliferate, meaning you choose any number of players or permanents, then for each kind of counter on those permanents and players, you put an additional counter on them. It also gives them the ability where you can -12 them to take an extra turn. Finally, it has the ability where, whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you choose a counter on target permanent and then put an extra counter of a kind on that permanent. The combo here is to just have 13 Planeswalkers on the field. By proliferating with 12 of these Planeswalkers and then -12 the last one to take an extra turn, you can just keep doing this forever and eventually win. Now, there are a lot of very obvious problems with this strategy. First off, not only is getting 13 Planeswalkers out very hard, it's made worse by the legendary rule. All Planeswalkers are legendary, meaning you can't have multiple copies of the same Planeswalkers on the battlefield at once. This means you'll have to play at least 13 different Planeswalkers in your deck. Most decks don't even play 13 Planeswalkers in the first place. In fact, almost no decks play more than 4 or 5 Planeswalkers at the most. Trying to find 13 different Planeswalkers that are worth playing is already rough, but this also makes the strategy very weak to removal. If your opponent answers even a few of your walkers, you'll quickly run out of Planeswalkers to actually get the loop started. The best way to make this work is probably using it alongside Jace, Cunning Castaway. The only ability that matters in the card is a -5, which makes 2 copies of Jace that aren't legendary. Once you get the first Jace up to enough loyalty, you can just make 2 copies of them and start proliferating them until you can make even more copies. If you're able to protect them long enough, you could eventually get to 13 copies of Jace, though this isn't very practical. The issue is that protecting your Planeswalkers for this long just isn't going to happen very often. While you can technically go infinite with the combo, this isn't the kind of thing that will ever actually happen. And at number 7, we have Double Cast and Reverberate, or any number of other similar cards. Double Cast is a sorcery that costs 2 red. It has the effect where, the next time you cast an instant or sorcery spell this turn, you copy it, and you choose new targets for your copy. Reverberate is an instant with a mana cost of 2 red. It has the effect where you copy target instant or sorcery spell, and you can yet again choose new targets for the copy. This may seem a bit weird to have an infinite between these 2 cards, since they're so similar, but there is a way to pull it off. You actually need to have 2 copies of Double Cast. First, you cast 1 Double Cast, then you cast the second. This triggers the ability of the first Double Cast, getting you a copy of Double Cast. So, the stack currently has 2 copies of Double Cast on the stack. What you do is allow the copy to resolve. Then you hold priority and cast Reverberate, targeting your Double Cast. At this point, you have a Double Cast trigger waiting to resolve, so you'll get a copy of Reverberate. You can choose new targets for this copy, so you change the target to the original copy of Reverberate. You let that resolve, getting another copy of Reverberate, targeting Reverberate, and congratulations. You now infinitely are copying a single spell over and over again for seemingly no reason. To get this combo to work, you really just need to copy a spell that can copy spells, such as Reverberate, so you can also use 2 Reverberates and then just target any other spell. The double cast method is just one of the easiest ways to get the loop started. Now, this is a useless infinite. However, like most infinites that don't do anything, with an extra card, you can actually make them useful. The issue, and the thing that makes this infinite such a bad one, is how much worse this is than any other method of trying to get this infinite started. A fairly well-known combo that's similar is Chain of Smog and Professor Onyx. Chain of Smog is a sorcery for 2 mana that makes target player discard 2 cards, and then that player can copy the spell and change its targets. Professor Onyx has a few abilities, but the relevant one is a 3 static Magecraft ability that triggers whenever you cast a copy or instant or sorcery spell. This ability allows you to gain 2 life and then have each opponent lose 2 life. What you do is have Onyx on the battlefield and then cast Chain of Smog targeting yourself. You can then choose to copy it as many times as you want, discarding your hand in the process, but dealing 2 damage to your opponents each time. The reverberating style infinites were well known but basically entirely pointless before the Magecraft ability, and now are simply bad. The setup it requires is just a little too high, especially when, in a lot of formats, Chain of Smog is right there and is much better as a combo piece for these decks. And at number 6, we have Faceless Butcher. This is a 2/3 Nightmare Butcher with a mana cost of 2 and 2 black. It has abilities where, when it enters the battlefield, you can exile another target creature. When it leaves the battlefield, you return the exile card to the battlefield under its owner's control. This is one of the earliest versions of this effect, and there were a few issues with how it worked that Wizards worked out with the future, similar cards. You see, this card had a few issues, and one of them was what happened when you had too many copies of the card out at once. Let's say you used a Faceless Butcher to exile a token from your opponent on an otherwise empty board, and then for some reason play an extra copy of Butcher. At that point, the only valid target for the mandatory end of the battlefield ability of the Butcher would be the first copy of Faceless Butcher. Then if you somehow played a 3rd copy of Faceless Butcher, you'd be forced to exile the 2nd Butcher. This will return the first Butcher to the battlefield, which will trigger. If there are no other creatures on the battlefield, you'll be forced to exile the 3rd Butcher, which will return the 2nd copy, which will cause the loop to repeat infinitely. The worst thing about this is that, if there are no creatures on the battlefield, you'll be forced to choose another Butcher as a target for each ability, making this loop entirely mandatory. This means this will be another softlock. However, in this instance, it's entirely forced. With other loops like this, players have a choice in the matter, which means they'll be forced to stop the loop if it's not doing anything. However, if the loop is forced, then the game will just keep going forever. In a situation like this, the game is ended in a draw. But this isn't exactly a good outcome in a game. This is why more recent versions of this effect, such as Banishing Light, only let you exile cards your opponent controls, as this prevents loops like this from occurring. Similar to almost all bad infinites, there are ways to make it actually good. With cards like Perforos, God of the Forge, each time a Butcher hits the battlefield, Perforos deals 2 damage to each opponent, which will allow you to win the game as the loop continues. This is the first of multiple infinites on this list that just results in a game ending in a draw, but they do get worse as time goes on. And at number 5, we have Bog Serpent and Assault Suit. Bog Serpent is a 5/5 serpent with a mana cost of 5 and 1 black. It has abilities where it can't attack unless the defending player controls a swamp, and if you don't control a swamp, you have to sacrifice Bog Serpent. Assault Suit is an artifact equipment with a mana cost of 4 and an equip cost of 2. It has the ability where the equipped creature gets +2/+2, it has haste, can't attack you or planeswalkers you control, and can't be sacrificed. At the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, you may have the player gain control of the equipped creature until the end of the turn and untap it. This one takes a little bit more rules knowledge to understand where the infinite comes in. It starts with putting Assault Suit onto the Bog Serpent and then giving it to your opponent with the suit's ability. If that player doesn't control a swamp, the serpent will try to sacrifice itself. This is where the rules knowledge comes in. You see, the ability will try to make them sacrifice this serpent and Assault Suit will stop it from happening. However, as soon as it finishes triggering, it will trigger again. This may seem a bit weird if you know just a bit about how the game works. After all, the condition for the ability to trigger was met after it triggered while the ability was on the stack. So why didn't it trigger when the game checked if any abilities triggered at that point? This is because Bog Serpent's ability to sacrifice itself is what's called a state-triggered ability. This means it triggers whenever the game state is at a certain point, rather than whenever a certain event occurs. Built into the rules for these types of abilities is the ruling that they only trigger if there isn't a trigger from the ability on the stack. That way, when the game checks for what should trigger, it can know to discount any of these state triggers while they're trying to resolve. However, as soon as the ability resolves and Assault Suit stops from being sacrificed, it will trigger again. As long as Bog Serpent remains on the field and your opponent continues to not have any swamps, it will keep triggering and hold the game hostage, once again forcing a draw. Like most of these combos, if a player has an instant speed interaction, they can get out of the draw, but if they don't have access to it at that exact point in the game, it will just end right there. And at number 4, we have Life and Limb and Spore Mound. Life and Limb is an enchant with a mana cost of 3 and 1 green. It is the ability where all forests and all saplings are 1/1 green saproling creatures and forest lands in addition to their other types. Spore Mound is a 3/3 fungus with a mana cost of 5. It has landfall, meaning that whenever a land enters the battlefield, an ability triggers, in this case making a 1/1 green saproling creature token. Spore Mound just so happens to make the exact kind of creature that Life and Limb turns into a land, meaning anytime a land enters the battlefield, you'll make a 1/1 saproling that's also a land, which will of course cause the ability to trigger again. Unfortunately for you in this scenario, Spore Mound is not a May ability, meaning you'll be forced to perform this loop infinitely and draw the game. Similar to with the Faceless Butcher loop, this can be made to win the game with cards that trigger when creatures enter the battlefield, so it can be made somewhat practical. The reason why Spore Mound is higher on this list is because it's not more likely to happen. The Faceless Butcher loop will only happen if there's no other creatures on the battlefield. This will take place anytime both cards are on the field under your control. As soon as either a land or a saproling comes down, the loop will start. On top of that, both of these cards are actually pretty playable in Commander, so players may accidentally start this loop without realizing what they're doing before accidentally forcing a draw. While they aren't the worst combos around, they still aren't something you want to accidentally do to yourself, or else you might be forced to use one of your own removal spells to out your combo. And at number 3, we have Transcendence and Reign of Gore. Transcendence is an enchant with a mana cost of 3 and 3 white. It is abilities where you don't lose the game for having 0 or less life. When you have 20 or more life, you win the game, and whenever you lose life, you gain 2 life for each life you lost. Reign of Gore is an enchant with a mana cost of 1 black and 1 red. It is ability where, if a spell or ability would cause its controller to gain life, it instead makes them lose that much life. So, if you have both of these cards on the battlefield, and then would lose any amount of life, Transcendence will trigger to try to make you gain twice that much life. When it resolves, Reign of Gore will switch that to losing that much life. This will cause Transcendence to trigger again, causing you to try to gain twice that much life, and then eventually you'll just start losing more and more comically large amounts of life. Now, this isn't exactly practical to get to work, but if you do ever put it all together, you'll get the upside of either forcing a draw or instantly losing the game. As soon as Transcendence leaves the battlefield, you'll no longer have the ability preventing you from losing from having less than 0 life, causing you to lose. If Reign of Gore is removed, you'll be able to gain all that life back, which will, if timed correctly, cause you to go back over 20 life and lose due to Transcendence. An infinite that's only purpose is to draw the game that's incredibly impractical and can easily result in you losing is pretty obviously one of the worst infinites around. And at number 2, we have Stuffy Doll and Pariah. Stuffy Doll is a 0/1 artifact creature construct with a mana cost of 5. It is indestructible, meaning any amount of damage and destroy effects won't destroy it. And the ability is where, as it enters the battlefield, you choose a player. Whenever Stuffy Doll is dealt damage, it deals that much damage to that chosen player, and you can tap the Stuffy Doll to deal 1 damage to itself. Pariah is an enchantment aura with a mana cost of 2 and 1 white. It has Enchant Creature and the ability where all damage that would be dealt to you is dealt to the enchanted creature instead. The setup for the combo is to play Stuffy Doll and choose yourself as a target, then you enchant Stuffy Doll with your Pariah. As soon as Doll takes any damage, it will try to deal damage to you, but Pariah will make it deal damage to itself instead. This will obviously cause an infinite loop, as every time Stuffy Doll would deal damage to itself, it would then trigger to deal damage to itself again. As another indefinite mandatory loop, this also causes the game to end in a draw. There are a couple of reasons why this is so high on this list. The first is that trying to stop the loop is very difficult. One half is an indestructible creature that's immune to most forms of removal, and the other half is an enchantment, a card type the removal for is very uncommon. This means that it's one of the least likely loops to break on the entire list. The other reason why it's so high is what you miss out on for doing this as opposed to doing sensible things with your cards. Putting a Pariah on a Stuffy Doll, naming your opponent, is a very powerful setup, and as any and all damage that would be dealt to you will be dealt instead to them. So to set this loop up, you would have to give up a virtual lock on the game that would make it to where your opponent would have to find a very specific piece of removal to ever be able to win, and instead decide to draw the game. The fact that you've decided to do this instead of winning is why the card is the second worst infinite in the game. And finally at number 1, we have Cage Sun, Ashaya Soul of the Wild, and Ensoul Artifact. Really, Cage's Sun is the most important card here, as the other 2 cards can easily be replaced with other similar cards. Cage Sun is an artifact with a mana cost of 6. His ability is where, as it enters the battlefield, you choose a color. Creatures you control of the chosen color get +1/+1, and whenever the ability of a land you control would produce mana of the chosen color, add 1 additional mana of that color. Ashaya Soul of the Wild is a legendary elemental with a mana cost of 3 and 2 green. It is the abilities where its power and toughness are each equal to the number of lands you control, and all non-token creatures you control are forest lands in addition to their other types. Insult Artifact is an aura enchantment with a mana cost of 1 and 1 blue. It has Enchant Artifact in the abilities, where the enchanted artifact is a 5/5 creature in addition to its other types. The setup is to have Cage Sun on the field, naming green. You enchant it with Insult Artifact and then play a Shaya. This will make Cage Sun a 6/6 artifact creature land, and also make it a proverbial bomb that can destroy the game at any moment. If you try and tap Cage Sun for mana, then the whenever an ability of a land you control adds mana ability will trigger, as Cage Sun is now a land. This will cause it to add another green mana. When it does this, the ability will trigger again, because the ability of Cage Sun, which is now a land, just added mana. This will cause another infinite loop, Cage Sun repeatedly adding mana and triggering off of the ability. The thing that makes this different is that this is a mana ability. Mana abilities are a very specific type of ability that have additional rules around them in order to make sure players can get the mana they need for their plays. They can be activated at any time, including while paying for a spell and in response to things like split-second spells. But most importantly, they can't be responded to. Once this loop starts, it can't end, no matter what cards players have access to or how much mana they have up. It's the most difficult interrupt infinite that just draws the game, and there's not any infinite in the game that compares to it in terms of what it can do. One of the main draws of Commander as a format are the commanders. Being able to build your entire deck knowing you have access to a specific card allows you to go for strategies that you normally wouldn't consider. However, not every commander is built the same, and some commanders make you jump through a ton of hoops to do anything or just don't work in the format for some reason or another. There are far more than just 10 cards that fit this category, but today we're going to go over some of the most egregious examples. Starting us off at number 10, predictably, we have Barktooth Warbeard. This is a legendary 6/5 human warrior with a mana cost of 4, 1 black and 2 red. It has no abilities whatsoever. This is a card from Legends, a set that introduced both the first legendary creatures in the game and the first multicolored cards. This led to a few major issues with the design. For some reason, Wizards seems to think that these cards being multicolor was an upside, and made them less efficient, not more efficient. This is an issue that, to most players in modern times, is fairly obvious. But before multicolor cards became the norm, players and designers alike didn't realize that a card being multicolor was a downside. A card having more specific mana requirements of any kind makes casting them more difficult, and in order to account for that, multicolored cards, or cards with multiple colored mana symbols in their cost, have to be made slightly more powerful to be worth playing. So when you take a mechanic that was misunderstood and made worse than it should have been on purpose, and combine it with several decades of power creep, what do you get? You get one of the most common jokes of the Magic the Gathering community. Barktooth is here as a stand-in for basically all of the legendary creatures from this set, as almost all of them are completely unplayable with only a few legends that do basically anything. There are several legends like Warbeard over here that are vanillas that don't even pass the vanilla test. Torsten von Ursus, Tobias Andrion, Sir Chandalar of Ebron, and so many other cards that are worse than the average common for any recent set. Now, you may be wondering why these cards are only at the number 10 spot on this list instead of being higher up. The main reason is that the infamy of the card sort of gives them a purpose in the format as a joke commander. You see, as a more casual format, Commander is less focused on winning and more focused on having fun. Playing an old Legends Commander won't win you many games, but it can work as sort of a deck build challenge. However, there are lots of commanders that don't have a place in the community as a meme and don't work well in a format mechanically, which is why Legends Commanders, while bad, are one of the least bad commanders. And at number 9, we have Bortuk Bone Rattle. This is a 4/4 Troll Shaman with a mana cost of 4, 1 black and 1 green. It is the ability where, when it enters the battlefield, if you cast it, you choose target creature card in your graveyard. If its mana value is less than or equal to a number of basic land types amongst lands you control, you return it to the battlefield, but otherwise you simply return it to your hand. This ability is technically a domain ability, which is an ability word that signifies that the ability has something to do with the number of basic land types you have in play. Bortuk is generally a pretty alright card that doesn't translate well into being a commander at all. The main issue is that in Commander, there's a rule called the Color Identity Rule. You probably already know what this is, but basically it stops you from playing any cards with a color identity that isn't contained within your commander's color identity. A card's color identity refers to all of the color of the cards and all the mana symbols that appear anywhere on the card. And this does technically include the ability to tap for mana on lands with basic land types. This means that you can't run any islands, plains, or mountains in your deck if your commander is Bortuk. This means that, at most, without some additional shenanigans, you'll only be able to reanimate a 2 mana value creature with Bortuk. You can simply use it as a Raise Dead effect instead, but this just isn't worth it. Now, there are a few ways to get around Bortuk's restrictions. Prismatic Omen and cards like it can give your lands all land types without breaking any of the color identity rules, allowing you to get a domain of 5. The thing is, this just isn't really worth it. Having to tutor a card like that just to make it so your commander can reanimate a reasonably sized creature is really silly, when you have access to options like Marin of Clan Neltoth, who can also either reanimate or return creatures from your graveyard to your hand, but does so at the end of every turn and is much easier to use to reanimate larger creatures. At the end of the day, even if you're a big fan of Bortuck, it just makes a lot more sense to run it in the 99 of a deck with more colors in it so that you can actually get good use out of its domain ability, which seems to be where most people decide to use the card, looking at its usage stats in EDH Rec. And at number 8, we have Arashi the Sky Asunder, though Jiwari the Earth of Flame is so similar that it's basically also in the same spot. Arashi is a 5/5 legendary spirit with a mana cost of 3 and 2 green. It has abilities where you can pay X, 1 green, and tap it to deal X damage to target creature with flying. It also has Channel for X and 2 green, which allows you to pay the mana cost and discard the card from your hand to deal X damage to each creature with flying. Flying, for anyone who might not know, is a keyword that makes it so that the creature can only be blocked by other creatures with flying. Jiwari is the polar opposite of this card. Jiwari is a legendary 3/3 spirit that costs 3 and 2 red. It has a similar channel ability that deals X damage to each creature without flying, but instead costs X and 3 red to channel. While on the field, it lets you pay X and 1 red to tap it to deal X damage to target creature without flying. These are obviously meant to be mirror images of each other, and they have basically all the same problems, though Jiwari happens to fare slightly better in the format overall. The first big issue is that the channel ability is basically impossible to use if the card is your commander, as the card in the commander zone isn't in your hand. It's very difficult to get your commander into your hand, and it's not really worth the investment for either of these cards. A few cards like Campfire and Command Beacon can put cards directly into your hand, but they're few and far between, and far from consistent. Outside of those cards, you'll have to rely on bouncing them from the field to your hand, which is just far too much work for the effect. So we need to analyze them for their ability while they're on the field. The big problem with Arashi is that your opponents having flying creatures isn't a guarantee in the slightest. Green decks generally struggle against flyers, as green is the color that gets access to flying creatures least often. However, giving up your command zone for an answer to flying creatures is kind of a waste. Green has access to tons of cards like Whiptongue Hydra and Hurricane, which can both answer a huge number of flying creatures. And in the case of Whiptongue, green has ways to tutor up creatures rather easily. If you want to play a mono-green deck, it makes a lot more sense to just play a proactive commander and put Arashi into your 99. Jiwari isn't great, but fares much better, to the point that without its connection to Arashi, it wouldn't even be mentioned at all. It can answer most creatures, and it's not necessarily bad as much as it is just not optimal. The card is just too reactive, as proactive commanders are usually considered more powerful and fun. Reactive commanders need to do a lot more to outpace 3 other players, and an overpriced removal spell stapled to a commander isn't enough, even when you can actually use it somewhat consistently. And at number 7, we have Tetzmoc Primal Death. This is a legendary 6/6 Elder Dinosaur with a mana cost of 4 and 2 black. It has Death Touch, meaning any amount of damage it deals to a creature is enough to destroy it. You can pay 1 black and reveal it from your hand to put a prey counter on target creature, but only during your turn. And finally, when it enters the battlefield, you can destroy all creatures with prey counters on them. This is a member of the cycle of Elder Dinosaurs and Rivals of Izalian, 1 for each color. Tetzmoc is very similar to the last card on this list in the sense the problem with the card is that you really want it in your hand. However, here the issue hurts a lot more, as if Tetzmoc isn't in your hand, it basically can't do anything. A 6 mana 6/6 Death Touch is a very unexciting creature, but what's worse is that it's just very disappointing. There are certainly worse commanders out there in terms of just how powerful they are. The creatures from Legends are even worse in terms of stats, but you're not losing anything by playing them as your commander because they're just bad cards. Tetzmoc is, while not amazing, a very interesting card with a lot of play on it. But putting the card into your command zone, you just lose out on all of that, which makes it a less attractive prospect than simply playing a worse card as your commander. What makes it such a bad choice for commander isn't what it does, but rather what it can no longer do. Tetzmoc loses more than just any other legendary creature by being made a commander, which is why, despite there being weaker cards in a vacuum, it's an overall worse commander. And at number 6, we have Nyambi, Faithful Healer. This is a legendary 2/2 human cleric with a mana cost of 1, 1 white, and 1 blue. It is the ability where, when it enters the battlefield, you search your library and/or graveyard for a card named Teferi, Timebender, reveal it, and then put it into your hand, then shuffle. So, to understand this card, we need to go over Teferi, Timebender. This is a 5 loyalty planeswalker with a mana cost of 4, 1 white, and 1 blue. It has the abilities where you can +2 it to untap up to 1 target creature artifact. You can -3 him to gain 2 life and draw 2 cards. Then you can also -9 him to take an extra turn after this one. This is a pretty weak planeswalker for 6 mana, as a +2 isn't even always useful, and the -3 is a bit overcosted, though the effect is quite good. You may be asking why this card is so much worse than the average planeswalker. And eagle-eyed watchers may notice that Teferi's collector number is over the greatest number in the set. This is because these cards are both from the pre-constructed Planeswalkers decks, an intro product with purposefully powered down Planeswalkers printed into them. Each of these decks also has a card that searches out the deck's Planeswalker as a way to give the deck extra copies of the face card without actually giving them more copies. Newbie filled this role for the pre-constructed deck, though the fact that it's a legendary creature means that you can run it as a commander to find Teferi Timebender whenever you want, which would be a very powerful ability to have access to if the card wasn't terrible. Again, these were pre-constructed decks, and we all know how stingy wizards are with their precons. Even being able to find Teferi multiple times throughout a game to draw tons of cards off its -2 ability just isn't worth it when you could be playing basically anything else. Though I suppose that might work as a joke commander, especially if you just don't play Timebender in your deck at all. Still, there's a reason why this card is only found in a grand total of 109 decks on EDH Rec. And at number 5, we have Phage the Untouchable. This is a legendary 4/4 avatar minion with a mana cost of 3 and 4 black. It is abilities where, when it enters the battlefield, if you didn't cast it from your hand, you lose the game. Whenever it deals combat damage to a creature, you destroy that creature and it can't be regenerated, which is basically just a finicky version of Death Touch. But there are some differences. Finally, when it deals combat damage to a player, that player loses the game. A lot of people probably saw this card coming, as it's very obvious what the issue with Phage is. When you cast Phage from the commander zone, you won't be playing her from your hand, so her enter the battlefield trigger will just kill you. There are ways around this, such as using cards like Torpor Orb to stop her entering the field from causing the ability to trigger at all. Of course, needing to find one of the few very specific cards to make it so that you can even cast your commander at all is a huge ask. This gets even worse, however. If your opponents remove whatever effect is allowing Phage to not kill you in response to you casting her, well, it will go through and you'll lose. This is made even worse by the fact that your opponent will know you're playing Phage, and because Phage one-shots players, they'll be aware of you from the start. So they're a lot more likely to leave up interactions, especially if they see that you have a way to actually cast Phage. All this together makes the card kind of unplayable. However, it's another pretty infamous card, and the fact that its effect is so polarizing means that Phage could be seen as an interesting deck build challenge, which is why it's not higher up on this list. And at number 4, we have the Unspeakable. This is a legendary 6/7 spirit with a mana cost of 6 and 3 blue. It has flying and trample, meaning it can deal excess combat damage to a defending player or planeswalker. It also has the ability where, when it deals combat damage to a player, you return target arcane card from your graveyard to your hand. Arcane is just an instant and sorcery card type that the card checks for. It's basically a small archetype of cards that work together. Now, the Unspeakable may just seem overcosted at first glance, but there's a bit more to the card than there looks at first glance. You see, the Unspeakable was meant to work with a series of arcane cards that would cheaply put it into play. Reach Through Mist is an instant for 1 blue that draws you a card. Peer Through Depths is an instant that costs 1 and 1 blue and lets you look at the top 5 cards of your library, reveal an instant or sorcery, put it into your hand, and put the rest in the bottom of your library in any order. Finally, Sift Through Sands lets you draw 2 cards and then discard a card for 1 and 2 blue. But if you cast both Reach Through Mist and Peer Through Depths, you get to search your library for the Unspeakable and put it directly into the battlefield. Now, this isn't exactly the best strategy around, but it's far better than actually trying to cast the Unspeakable for its mana cost. The Unspeakable is very overcosted, especially since, as we'll get into in a bit, the arcane cards aren't the best bunch of cards around. All 3 parts of the combo also let you get more cards from your library, making pulling off the combo easier. Though in Commander, it's still not very likely to happen. Finding 3 one-ofs in a 99 card deck just isn't likely to happen. Additionally, if you do actually manage to cheat the Unspeakable out this way, it means you'll have arcane spells in your graveyard to get back anyway. Despite the fact that this strategy is naturally made worse in Commander, and the fact that it wasn't very good in its 60 card formats, playing the Unspeakable as your commander is still a pretty big downside. I would say you're better off trying to pull off the combo naturally. But really, you're probably better off just trying to cheat the Unspeakable out some other way and just playing a good number of arcane cards in your deck to get back. Now, this leads to other issues, which is that the arcane spells aren't all that great. There are some good ones here and there, but they're usually very context specific. Ideas Unbound lets you draw 3 for 2 mana, but makes you discard that many cards at the end of your turn. It's very good in certain combo decks, but isn't a great value card. Ribbons of the Reikai lets you draw a card for each spirit you control for 5 mana, which is okay if you're playing a lot of spirits. But there are better cards for the job most of the time. Outside of the more situational cards, you have a bunch of just okay cards, like Eye of Nowhere, a 2-mana sorcery that bounces any permanent. If you're running the Unspeakable as your commander, you'll have to be playing a good number of arcane cards, which means you'll be forced to run quite a few subpar cards to make it work. Even if you're a really big Kamigawa fan, there's much better ways to build an arcane deck than running the Unspeakable. And at number 3, we have Chomano Revolutionary. This is a legendary 2/2 human rebel with a mana cost of 2 and 2 white. It is the ability where you prevent all damage that would be dealt to it. This is a very underwhelming ability, especially on a 4 mana card. The card can block basically everything for free, but it's not going to be killing much of anything with only 2 power. Not to mention that most good attackers will have some form of evasion, meaning they'll be able to get around Chomano without too much trouble. The card is even worse on attacks, as any 3 toughness creature will just wall it out permanently. A 2 power creature for 4 mana with no other abilities just isn't impactful enough, no matter how hard it is to kill in combat. It's worth specifying in combat because it's very easy to remove basically through any other means. Kill spells like Murder or board wipes like Wrath of God will have no problem answering Chomano, which is an issue because it makes it very difficult to actually take advantage of the card. The best way to try to take advantage of Chomano's ability would be going the Voltron route, which is what Magic players call throwing a bunch of equipment and auras to make it a larger threat. The main issue with this strategy is how a single board wipe or kill spell completely blows you out of the water. Players will normally prioritize protecting their creature or doing damage even more quickly to try and circumvent this, but Voltron strategies tend to still struggle to close out games. Chomano could be suited up in this way, but he's not good at dealing damage fast, nor is he particularly hard to remove. I'm only bringing this up because this is the only way to take advantage of the card's abilities as a commander. The ability to prevent all damage you would take can synergize with it if it were in black or red. You can combine it with cards like Pyrohemia or Pestilence, and combine it with any of the red's damage-based board wipes. White doesn't have many effects that deal damage to their own creatures, which makes using this damage prevention very difficult. The only real way to take advantage of the effect is combat, and as I've already gone over, that's not very practical. Chomano isn't just not good, it's also really boring. There's just not much that you can even try to do with the card, which means that there's not really even much in the way of interesting decks to build with it, which makes it a much worse commander overall. And at number 2, we have Ordic Bloodcursed. This is a legendary 3/3 vampire soldier with a mana cost of 1, 1 red, and 1 white. It is the ability where, when Ordic enters the battlefield, you create X blood tokens, where X is the number of keyword abilities from amongst the ones listed on Ordic. Blood tokens, for the uninitiated, are artifact tokens that you pay 1 mana, tap and sacrifice them, and discard a card to draw another card. The specific abilities it looks for are Flying, First Strike, Double Strike, Death Touch, Haste, Hexproof, Indestructible, Lifelink, Menace, Reach, Trample, and Vigilance. Now, Ordic technically has some more uses than a lot of the other cards on this list, but the context surrounding Ordic makes it a lot worse. Ordic has been a recurring character on Innistrad ever since our first trip to the plane. He's appeared on 2 of his own cards, Ordic Master Tactician and Ordic Lunarch Marshal. Master Tactician allows how to choose how creatures block if it and at least 3 other creatures attack, and Lunarch Marshal will check for any of your creature's keywords at the start of combat and give them to all of your other creatures. These are both really fun commanders to build around, even if they aren't particularly strong, and Ordic as a character is very well liked. This makes Ordic Bloodcursed a major letdown in terms of card design. The main issue is that getting blood tokens just isn't that good of a payoff, especially considering that Ordic's condition for giving you those blood tokens is a bit difficult to put into practice. There's also the issue that just making blood tokens alone really isn't enough of a payoff. Blood tokens are useful, but not a big enough payoff that you'd build your entire strategy around them without some other way to make use of the tokens. With Ordic, the best thing to do would play cards like Hero Pure Aether Grip to tap the bloods to deal damage. While this is a good way to use Ordic, it doesn't stop the feeling of being a disappointment. Not to mention, all those roles can be filled better by other cards. While Ordic can work as a good bit player in a blood-focused deck in a 60-card format, running it as your commander only feels underwhelming. And finally, at number 1, we have Grandmother Sengir. This is a legendary 3/3 human wizard with a mana cost of 4 and 1 black. It is the ability where you can pay 1 and 1 black and tap Grandma to give target creature -1/-1 until end of turn. This is a legendary creature from Homelands, an older set that's also known for having some of the worst legends in the game, though not quite as famous as those from the set Legends. Grandmother Sengir is maybe the worst of the bunch, though Valdrain of Sengir gives her a run for her money. Grandma is very difficult to do any work with for multiple reasons. Giving a creature -1/-1 isn't particularly effective. It can snipe some important creatures, but a lot of the most important creatures in the format, even utility creatures, will be too large for this to matter. For example, cards like Collector Oof and Oracle Moldiah are 2 toughness utility creatures that you'd really want to be able to remove. On top of all this, Sengir costs 2 mana and requires her to be tapped to activate. The mana cost is honestly a little steep for a 5 mana card that you can only activate once each turn, and requiring you to wait a turn or find a way to give Grandma haste in order to use her hurts a lot. In order to make Grandma useful, you'd probably need to find some way to repeatedly untap her and use her ability again to be able to bring down some bigger creatures, which will likely get very expensive very quickly. Not to mention, there just aren't all that many ways to untap her in black in the first place. Grandma Sengir has almost no uses in the format. It's not a powerful card, there aren't many unique ways to make or use her effects, and it doesn't even really work as a joke commander or a deck build challenge. You basically just have to not play a commander if you want to run her. And without anything interesting to do with the card, Grandmother Sengir is ultimately, overall, the worst commander in the entire game. Commander is defined by its unique limitations and rules that set apart from the more inherently competitive formats. While these rules make Commander the format that it is, it also means certain cards are better or worse in formats because of it. In particular, there are many cards that have seen great success into the competitive formats that are pretty bad when using Commander. While this is a topic that's been discussed on the channel previously, there are enough notable cards great in other formats that are bad in Commander that it warrants a revisit. And starting off at number 10, we have Show and Tell. This sorcery costs 2 generic and 1 blue mana and allows each player to put an artifact, creature, enchantment, or land card from their hand onto the battlefield. Show and Tell allows you to cheat on the mana cost for game-ending threats at the cost of giving your opponent the chance to do the same. This has made the card a mainstay of the Legacy format where bombs like Grizzlebrand are deployed as early as the first turn with consistent free counter magic to protect Show and Tell. Most decks in Legacy run spells at the lowest mana values possible, meaning that while the Show and Tell player will cheat on mana cost, their opponent may receive little to no value in comparison. This logic tracks far less in the Commander format where decks are built with much wider mana curves. Commander games go much longer than games of Legacy, with many decks running powerful high mana permanents since they'll have the time to slowly build the mana to finally cast them. As such, Show and Tell has much more risk in a Commander pod, since not only are there multiple opponents who can profit off of your spell, it's very likely the permanent they drop into play is as powerful if not more so than yours. Beyond that, there's far less room to win the game off of the back of a single Show and Tell in Commander. With multiple opponents to chew through, you'll only be able to snowball the game into your favor if you cheat out an especially powerful permanent. And that relies on you drawing both the permanent and the Show and Tell to cheat it out. Without the redundancy of multiple copies, Show and Tell is just simply too inconsistent Commander to really have much weight. Show and Tell isn't without its uses of course, but there are many cards that can cheat out powerful cards with less potential downsides and even lower costs that simply work better in the format. Show and Tell is a card that has not been printed in Modern and likely will not be due to the power level concerns, yet is a decidedly worse card when applied to the structure of the Commander format. Show and Tell shines in a format where most decks are not playing high mana value cards at all, whereas Commander is a format where many of those otherwise unplayable high mana value cards find a home in the first place. And at number 9, we have Flagstones of Trocaire. This legendary land can be tapped for 1 white mana and enters the battlefield untapped. When Flagstones of Trocaire is put into the graveyard from the battlefield, you may search your library for a Plains card and put onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. Flagstones of Trocaire is one of the rare cards that actively benefits from the game's legendary rule. If you control 2 or more legendary permanents with the same name, state-based actions require you to sacrifice until you control just 1. While most legendary cards use this ability solely as a restriction, Flagstones of Trocaire's ability makes it so when you sacrifice it to the legendary rule, you're allowed to search your library for a Plains. It doesn't search a basic Plains either, meaning the card is freely able to grab any land as long as it has the Plains subtype. Beyond color fixing, there are a few utility options this provides, such as searching up Mistveil Plains. This is an interaction that is missed out on in Commander, seeing as how your deck will only ever have a single copy of Flagstones of Trocaire. While a card like Thespian Stage could copy Flagstones, in practice this is inefficient and loses out on the incidental value offered from Flagstones. This doesn't make Flagstones outright unplayable in Commander, as it synergizes with cards that require you to sacrifice or destroy lands of your own. While these corner case combos and interactions give the card some function in Commander, the card loses out on a core part of its playability in formats like Legacy. Considering how the legendary rule is almost always a downside, the ability to turn it into a favor is a large part of Flagstone of Trocaire's identity as a card. As such, the card has very little identity in Commander, especially when relegated to arguably the least popular color in the format. Unless actively building around land synergies, there's little reason to run Flagstones of Trocaire in a Commander deck. And land decks only have so many slots for utility lands, especially land decks that use 3 or more colors. Flagstones only provides white, and while it can search for dual lands for color fixing, the setup required generally makes doing so much worse than simply cracking a fetch land. And at number 8, we have Chalice of the Void. This artifact costs XX generic mana, which means you can spend any amount of mana on it, as long as the mana values for X match. So if X is 1, you pay 2 mana total. If X mana's value is 2, you pay 4 mana total, and so on and so on. Chalice of the Void enters the battlefield with X charge counters on it, and whenever a player casts a spell with a mana value equal to the number of charge counters on Chalice of the Void, counter that spell. While Chalice of the Void isn't efficient for countering spells with mid-range or high mana value of X, it is extremely efficient at countering low mana value spells. In most every format it's legal in, Chalice of the Void often preys upon 1 mana value spells in particular. Decks are built to be able to do something impactful as early as possible. meaning most decks run several spells that cost a single mana. Black decks rely on hand disruptions such as Thoughtseize, blue has various cantrips, and practically every color has access to some form of removal for the cost of just 1 mana. Chalice of the Void completely shuts out all of these very common staples of the format, meaning it's rare that a Chalice with 1 charge counter won't limit the opponent in some way. And given the nature of Chalice of the Void's mana costs, in a matchup where it would be relevant, you can play Chalice of the Void for no mana at all, and have Chalice of the Void counter every single 0 mana value spell your opponent might cast. This interaction in specific has led to the card's restriction in Vintage, since the format relies heavily on 0 mana artifacts and other low cost spells. All of Chalice of the Void's strengths are dampened in Commander, however, where the game is much less reliant on low mana value spells. Obviously, many Commander decks are built to have low mana value spells, especially in more competitive playgroups. But even then, those decks tend to have more varied mana curves than your typical constructed 60 card decks. As such, Chalice of the Void loses out on the built-in consistency that makes it so powerful in other formats. A 1 charge counter Chalice will probably counter a few spells over the course of the game, but will likely not limit your opponent too much given any given game. And it's not really worth playing a Chalice with more charge counters, since there's really no guarantee what mana values will be most prevalent. Even dedicated artifact prison decks in the format tend to skip out on Chalice of the Void, given there are various effects that impact Commander games far more. And at number 7, we have Narcomoeba. This illusion costs 1 generic and 1 blue mana and has 1 power and toughness. It has the keyword flying, which makes it unblockable except by creatures with flying or reach. And when Narcomoeba is put into your graveyard from your library, you may put it onto the battlefield. While a 2 mana, 1 power flyer is nothing to write home about in any format, its interactions with being sent to the graveyard from the library have given it a home in various formats. There are decks that like to mill as many cards as quickly as possible to trigger various powerful graveyard effects and swarm the board with creatures that recur themselves from the graveyard. Not only does Narcomoeba simply bring itself back when it's milled, it doing so also will trigger the conditions to bring out a card like Prize Amalgam onto the field as well. Commander is no stranger to decks built around self-milling and utilizing the graveyard, so while the strategies that Narcomoeba plays into certainly exist in the format, the card itself doesn't quite fit the needs of the format. One of the strengths of Narcomoeba in a 60 card format is the ability to mill multiple copies through the course of the game. If a Prize Amalgam winds up in the graveyard after you've already gotten out one of the Narcomoebas, then there are still 3 more Narcomoebas in the deck to mill and trigger that Amalgam. In Commander, you only have that single copy of Narcomoeba, which is borderline useless if you draw it. Creatures in Commander are generally bigger as board states expand over the course of the game, and with 3 opponents, you're often going to be facing more combat than you would in a typical 1-on-1 game. The chip damage from a single Narcomoeba inherently has less value in a format where each opponent starts with 40 life. But even beyond Narcomoeba's low power level as an individual card, graveyard decks in Commander tend not to focus as much on the sort of aggressive creature swarming Narcomoeba supports. Commander decks that aim to self-mill tend to use the graveyard as a second hand essentially, and grind through the long game with extra resources. And graveyard decks less focused on grind game tend to take the combo approach, where they mill their entire graveyard in 1 turn and attempt to win the game on the spot. Narcomoeba is the backbone of recursive graveyard decks in Modern, Legacy, and even Vintage format. But Commander's graveyard decks tend to aim bigger as the board wipe heavy format does not favor all-in aggro decks like Narcomoeba demands. And at number 6, we have Remand. This instant costs 1 generic and 1 blue mana and counters target spell. If the spell is countered this way, you put it into your owner's hand instead of their graveyard. Then you draw a card. Unlike a traditional counterspell, Remand essentially delays a spell instead of outright answering it. This provides value in blue decks that simply aim to control the tempo of the game. If you counter the only spell your opponent can play that turn with a Remand, even though the card is back in their hand, they won't have the mana to use it again that turn. With leverage against an opponent who attempts to tap out, Remand offers a cheap way to answer whatever they play and basically skip their turn. Other counterspells of this mana value or lower tend to be limited in exactly what kinds of spells they can counter, or require more specific colors in their cost to make them harder to cast. Remand is in a sweet spot for formats like Modern, where it's efficient enough that it wins out over other, more permanent answers to cards. Thanks to Remand replacing itself with a card draw, it's not unlikely you'll manage to find another piece of interaction before your opponent untaps and tries to recast the spell. This tempo-oriented game plan works best when you're going back and forth with a singular opponent, since you only have to worry about the actions of a single player. Commander in general does not lend itself the best to this tempo style of gameplay, since there are more players to control the tempo of. In particular, a player has to consider not just if the spell is worth countering, but if an opponent whose turn is next might have an even more dangerous card in hand. As such, counterspells in Commander need to be effective and efficient, allowing control players to hold up interactions for multiple players before untapping. Remand's mana value isn't too unreasonable for the format, but the slower nature of the format simply means your opponent will have far more likely a chance to use the spell you Remand within a turn or two. A singles turn worth of tempo isn't as valuable in Commander as it is in a match of Modern. In one-on-one games, you can snowball the advantage from a powerful remand into taking control of the entire game with good draws, whereas in Commander, remand mostly serves as a delay and not much more. And at number 5, we have Dismember. This instant costs 1 generic and 2 Phyrexian black mana, which can be paid for with either black mana or 2 life. This means that technically Dismember can just cost 1 generic mana as well as 4 life. Dismember gives target creature -5 power and toughness until end of turn. It's notable that if this would reduce a creature's target toughness to 0 or less, the creature dies. This is a full removal that gets around permanents that cannot be destroyed, since the creature is not technically destroyed. The downside, of course, is that if a creature has 6 or more toughness, Dismember actually cannot kill it, meaning that it is not completely a universal removal spell. In most formats, this is not a problem given the relatively smaller size and most relevant creatures. What sets Dismember apart from other conventional removal spells is its Phyrexian mana cost, which allows decks that don't even use black mana to cast it. Some colors, such as blue, generally do not get access to hard creature removal, and Dismember offers those decks a technically generic option. The cost of 4 life, even in a 20 life format, is fairly minimal, with some decks actively benefiting from the cost. This uniquely powerful aspect of Phyrexian mana cards is somewhat lost in Commander, which has rules for deck color identity. A deck's color identity is determined by the colors of your commander. If your commander is red and white, you are not allowed to use cards that cost other colors. This even includes hybrid mana cost. If it is a color your commander does not include, you cannot run the spell in your deck. This limits Dismember to just black decks in Commander, since even though you don't need to pay black to cast it, it does count as a black card regardless. And black has no shortage of options for removal in Commander, with some spells that even technically cost less to cast in Dismember in the proper situations. As such, Dismember sees far less play in Commander, since its main claim to fame doesn't really work in the format. Mono-green decks in Modern Legacy are free to run Dismember if they so choose, and the option has led to its seen main deck and sideboard play for years. Meanwhile, in Commander, Dismember is just one of the many options for your black removal slots, which only gets more competitive with each new removal spell being printed. And at number 4, we have Urza's Tower. This land, which has a type line identical to its name, can be tapped for 1 colorless mana. If you control an Urza's Mine and an Urza's Power Plant, add 3 colorless mana instead. While Urza's Tower is the land chosen for this list, all 3 of these lands have similar effects and can essentially be counted together. Urza's Mine and Urza's Power Plant both also tap for 1 colorless mana, but then tap for 2 colorless mana if you control the other 2 lands as well. Altogether, this means when all 3 of these lands are on the board, they tap for a total of 7 colorless mana. These lands were given the name Tron lands, given that they need to combine multiple lands together, which reminded players of the animated series Voltron and its combining robots. These Tron lands predominantly see play in the modern format, where decks aim to get all 3 lands into the battlefield as fast as possible. Considering the deck requires specific named lands to function, these decks use cards such as Expedition Map to search out the specific cards. But a big strength of Tron decks is the inevitability. Even without searching with multiple copies of each land, it's not very difficult to get up to 7 mana on turn 3. From there, Tron decks overwhelm players with game-ending threats such as Karn Liberated that normally wouldn't come out until boards and mana bases were more developed. While this mana engine has seen play in various styles of decks throughout the years in competitive play, it has seen comparatively little focus in Commander. Even though Commander format has the same land searching cards as the other formats, only having 1 of each Tron land makes it difficult to get the synergy working. And since you are limited to just 1 of each copy, if anyone destroys your Urza Tower, not only is that land gone, but your other Tron lands now just produce 1 mana. This is a weakness even for Tron decks in Modern, but those decks at least have the ability to play replacement for the destroyed land. In Commander, your only option is to recur the land from the graveyard and hope it doesn't get exiled. And even then, you've only managed to produce 7 mana with 3 lands, which while a great rate, probably required a great deal of luck or effort to pull off. Whereas with other 60-card Tron decks, getting to 7 mana is really just the minimum of what the deck aims to do, with the 2nd and 3rd copies of each Tron land played only furthering that mana advantage. Commander has access to the most powerful mana-producing lands in the game, and thus generally has little want or need for the Tron lands. And at number 3, we have Cryptic Command. This instant costs 1 generic and 3 blue mana and allows you to choose 2 of 4 modes. Your options are to counter target spell, return target permanent to owner's hand, tap all creatures your opponent control, or draw a card. Any given spell with this mana cost that just had 2 of those effects on it would likely have never seen much play. But the modular nature of Cryptic Command made it into a versatile answer for control decks. As previously mentioned with Remand, control decks in these 60-card formats rely heavily on controlling the tempo of the game. While Cryptic Command isn't even castable for the first few turns of the game, 4 mana is generally the average top end of most decks in formats like Modern, with most games going long enough for these higher cost spells to be relevant. And Cryptic Command offers the control player a great deal of tempo, usually countering whatever spell your opponent just tapped out for, as well as some extra effect. Blue decks that lack hard removal options could bounce a permanent back to the hand to counter with another spell on a follow-up turn. And if no other mode was relevant, the card draw could just help the control player maintain their card advantage. The threat of Cryptic Command's tap-down mode would often force aggro decks to cast their spells in main phase 2, as to not give the control player the blowout of countering the spell and tapping down all their creatures before combat. However, just as these 60-card formats rely heavily on the back and forth of tempo, the frantic nature of Commander makes cards like Cryptic Command all the worse. In particular, it's Cryptic Command's mana cost that truly holds it back in Commander. Commander, especially at more competitive tables, is dominated by counter magic, like Fierce Guardianship, which can be cast for free. There are many 1 and 2 mana value counterspells that also see heavy play. But beyond that, counter magic tends to not see much success given how mana inefficient it is. Sublime Epiphany is a similar spell to Cryptic Command, which sees far more Commander play in part because of having stronger modes, such as creating a token that's a copy of a creature you control, but also because its mana cost is less intensive. It may cost 2 more mana overall, but 2 blue mana is much easier for multicolor decks than 3 blue mana. Many decks will struggle to cast Cryptic Command, where they could simply cast a different spell with a higher impact. And at number 2, we have Crashing Footfalls. This sorcery has no mana cost and instead has a suspend 4. Rather than casting Crashing Footfalls, you pay 1 green mana and exile it with 4 time counters. At the beginning of your upkeep, you remove a time counter, and when the last counter is removed, cast it without paying its mana cost. The card itself creates 2 green Rhino creature tokens with 4 power and toughness and the keyword Trample. This means any excess damage the Rhinos do in combat to a creature is dealt to its controller, limiting the effectiveness of chump blocking. Suspend is a fairly slow mechanic, and the card by itself would be somewhat underwhelming in any format, let alone Commander. However, given that the card technically has a mana value of 0 and has no restrictions preventing it from being cast, if a card effect casts the card for you, you can get the tokens without waiting for Suspend. The most effective way of doing this is with a Cascade spell. Whenever you cast a spell with Cascade, you exile cards on top of your library until you exile a non-land card that costs less than it. You may cast that spell without paying its mana cost, then put the exiled cards in the bottom of your library in any order. Since Crashing Footfalls costs 0, a Cascade spell of any mana value would work for casting it. Violent Outburst is the lowest mana value card that has the keyword inherently, and Crashing Footfall decks simply build their decks so that the only spells with a lower mana value than Violent Outburst are your copies of Crashing Footfalls. Cards like Fury provide spells that are high mana value yet usable on turn 1 and 2 to protect the deck long enough to cast a Cascade spell. In theory, you could build a Commander deck in a similar fashion, but in practice, not only would that limit you from the format's defining staples, the payoff is simply not all that practical for Commander. 8 power and toughness spread over 2 bodies is potent, but nothing to build a deck around in Commander. Those 2 tokens will be spread far too thin to find the sort of value they'd have in one-on-one games where there's only one player to attack. However, when it comes to threats from other formats that don't cut into Commander, Crashing Footfalls isn't necessarily the worst one can get. Finally, the number 1 card on this list is Delver of Secrets. This human wizard costs 1 blue mana and has 1 power and toughness. At the beginning of your upkeep, look at the top card of your library. You may reveal the card, and if it was an instant or sorcery, you may transform Delver of Secrets into Insectile Aberration. This human insect has 3 power, 2 toughness, and the keyword Flying. Delver of Secrets has seen success in various formats over the years, ranging from its time in Standard to still being one of the most relevant decks in Legacy. Delver is cheap to cast and comes down early, and with lucky top decks can start attacking for 3 damage in the air as early as your second turn. In a 20 life format, 3 damage attacks add up fast, and with only 1 opponent to worry about, it's easy for these Delver decks to protect their 1 threat with cheap counter magic like Daze. The real strength of these Delver decks in 60 card formats comes from the powerful draw spells and interactions of those formats. Brainstorm both sculpts your hand and sets the top of your deck to guarantee a Delver flip, and burn-based removal allows the deck to pivot between controlling the board to playing a more aggressive game with relative ease. This all falls away in the Commander format, which often relies on powerful, high mana value creatures and plenty of board wipes to answer them. Delver of Secrets is effective in a format where mana efficiency is the focus, as it's a threat designed for mana efficiency. Commander as a format is designed to last longer and provides players time to play the sorts of cards mana-efficient formats don't have the time for. As such, Delver of Secrets is outclassed by cards that will never see Legacy play specifically in the Commander format. Delver has been a meta-defining card in competitive 60-card Magic for over a decade at this point, but is somewhat antithetical to Commander as a format. Tempo has come up multiple times on this list because it's so much harder to control the tempo of a Commander game than in a one-on-one match. With 3 opponents to keep track of, your threats and answers need to be more potent even if it comes at the cost of efficiency. Delver offers efficiency at the cost of complexity, lacking the staying power needed for an average Commander pod, but being just dangerous enough that it can define competitive play for multiple formats.